351. Chapter 351. Nick could only postpone his trip to Nocturne Alley for now, as he needed Darty's help to get there. With that in mind, he finally chose to get to work on the method he chose to fill his need for star metal to make the Atronach forge. The plan was quite simple, really, as he was going to modify a broom to reach escape velocity and fly out of the Earth's atmosphere. That was unfortunately the easiest part of the plan. The hard part was that he needed to have a way to survive in the vacuum of space, as well as draw the floating debris orbiting the planet towards him to be harvested. He had no intention of even trying to reach the moon, however, despite it, logically speaking, having rich amounts of star metal from all the meteors that impacted it over its long existence. The reason for this is that the distance is simply too great to get there without teleporting or traveling so fast he would die. Escape velocity is unfortunately the best he could withstand, and returning to Earth is extremely easy, as he merely needed to use a portkey to be back without any issue at all. He knew for a fact that obtaining a portkey was actually fairly easy, all things considered, as there were no less than 4 in the room of hidden things. He knew this because spatial magic had a rather unique look to it in his magical senses, and he had studied the portkey that Ollivander used briefly to get a feel for what they felt like. The only problem Nick had with these portkeys was that he had no clue where they led to, and he was rather reluctant to test them. If they led to places in the Isles, then that would be perfect, but he had a sneaking suspicion that this wasn't the case. I should probably just put in a request to the Ministry for a portkey to Hogsmeade and wait for that, then risk it with these things. Nick decided and turned to look at the strange set of items on the table before him. The first was a full-sized suit of seamless clothes that he had enchanted heavily to protect him from cosmic radiation, the cold, and the vacuum of space, which was irritatingly difficult for him. He even had to create a complex choker built into the neck of the clothes that had the ability to store and release breathable air while also covering his head in a tight vacuum-proof bubble that he could see out of. These preparations alone took him nearly a week to finish in total, and that was only because he needed to test them in a true vacuum, which he did by using the realm to subject them to one. Having the realm made tests like this considerably easier than the sort of work that would normally be needed to do so. The final step he needed was the broom, portkey, and method of drawing the scattered star metal to him. The first of which was easy, as he simply made a flying broom out of ebony wood that had 7 bands of silver at different points on the handle. The bristles were made of white oak and had Daedric runes carved on them for stability and spatial movement. The 7 bands of silver dictated the protection the broom got from the vacuum, as well as speed, stability, steering, and mana storage. The finished product was a beast of a broom that hit escape velocity both within the atmosphere as well as out of it. Unfortunately, the enchantments that made this possible drained a stupid amount of energy to function, which was why Nick included the equivalent of 2 Dumbledores worth of mana in the battery rings, fueling the enchantments. After all, it was quite hard to bring a person up to the right speed to leave the atmosphere entirely. After that, though, it was much easier to move about, as there was little friction to slow or stop you. With this finished, Nick had to work on the thing he needed to draw the star metal to him. It was a series of 7 marbles made of what little star metal he had, and enchanted with a powerful attractive force that only worked on things made of the same material. He played a small trick on the enchantments, so that the enchantments only worked on the stuff in space, since it would be rather awkward if he stole all the star metal on the planet. It was a tempting thought, to be sure, but he doubted he could get away with it for very long, as a lot of angry wizards would be trying to figure out what the hell happened. 352. Chapter 352. Nick's plan for these marbles was rather simple, really, as he was going to set them in place with a spell so that they orbited the planet without falling, regardless of how heavy they become from collecting the free-floating star metal. After about a month, he theorized that they will have collected most, if not all, of the free-floating metal, at which point he will go and harvest the profits. While it may seem a waste to create the means to travel to space, just to only use it a handful of times, Nick knew it was necessary. The Atronach forge required a very large amount of star metal to get started, but once it was made, he would profit greatly from it. As for actually exploring the cosmos, Nick knew he was definitely not powerful enough for that, and that the actual preparations for such a thing were much more intense than this. Despite what many thought magic wasn't some rule-less thing that allowed wizards to bend reality without effort. There were very clear and strict rules when magic did anything at all, and it always demanded a cost to do it. Usually this was mana or life force, but there was no mistaking that there was a cost to all magic. The cost to travel the cosmos effectively would be so astronomical if done in the conventional manner that it wasn't even funny. Merely the cost to travel to the moon and back was so high that Nick had no way at all to pay it safely using that method. Instead, the route Nick wanted to use in the future was spatial magic travel such as teleportation. For a much smaller cost, a wizard could connect 2 points in space and hop between them regardless of distance in nearly an instant. Looks like I am all set minus the portkey from the ministry, but that should be here soon. Nick thought after testing the space suit he made in a vacuum in the realm while he was wearing it. The suit served its function well as wasn't affected by being in a vacuum at all, and still had full range of movement. Returning to the real world after changing out of the suit, Nick was satisfied with how well his plans were starting to come together. He had roughly 3.5 months before Beltane, so he should have all the ingredients he wanted for the ritual at that point. All of his many other plans were also coming together nicely as he took firm strides in each of them. He was especially looking forward to completing the Atronak Forge and getting started on his small army of magical servants that will help him greatly come the time when Zeus appears. Since he didn't have an exact date for that event and merely had the vague as hell, a few years after Grindelwald reboots the world, timeline he knew that he might need expendable forces to collect information and resources after he went into hiding. Atronachs fit that description to a T, and the best part is depending on what element they had, they were also immune to Zeus's most famous type of magic, lightning. Storm Atronachs were in fact totally immune to electricity, and in fact it only made them stronger. I imagine that Zeus is in for quite a rude awakening if he tries to smite one of them with a thunderbolt, Nick thought with a smirk. Despite wanting to complete these projects as fast as possible, Nick was forced to delay their finishes by factors outside his control. In this case, he was waiting for the ministry to send his portkey and for Darty to finish hunting a letherfold. He wasn't concerned about the time it was taking his house elf to accomplish this task, as the creatures were very hard to track down since they had few environmental factors as far as habitat was concerned. The only one known for sure was that they tended to inhabit tropical climates and were always near humans. Obviously, that didn't exactly narrow the search down a whole lot, considering how many people were spread out in places with tropical climates. As for the ministry's part in his plan for collecting star metal, it was merely the usual slow grind of bureaucracy holding up progress. With nothing pressing him for his attention, Nick finally reopened the doors of the workshop to his friends to hang out in for now. "How I've missed this place," Ron said, while lovingly stroking the woodworking equipment he hasn't been able to use for nearly a month. Tracy was not much different with the metal working equipment, but the rest were much better since their training didn't need the stuff. 353. Chapter 353. Stop being dramatic. I made sure you had equipment for your own crafts before I closed off the workshop, Nick said, rolling his eyes. It's not the same. Yours are so much better. Ron whined and Tracy nodded vigorously in agreement. Of course they are. Do you know how much money and time I've spent just ensuring the quality of my equipment? Nick asked rhetorically. I was kind enough giving you what I did to work with it all, so if you want better, get it yourself, Nick said sternly. What about us? Luna asked with a slightly tilted head. You and Harry don't even use equipment at all, Nick said with an exasperated sigh. That reminds me, but what have you been doing this whole time anyways? Daphne asked, and the rest also looked interested to know. Several things, actually, but mostly taking care of some of my more immediate concerns, like helping Professor Lupin with an important issue and moving some things forward, Nick said casually while sitting down on his usual chair. What could the professor need help from you for? Hermione asked with a confused expression. Nick shrugged. You'll have to ask him yourself since it's not my place to say, he said honestly. She seemed frustrated at this answer, but understood that it was likely a personal subject for Lupin and chose to leave it alone. It helped that everyone was aware that trying to press Nick for information he didn't want to give was really hard. He was very stubborn about keeping pieces of important information to himself when he spoke. All of his friends had gotten used to his constant use of half-truths or vague answers by now and knew better than to try and get more from him. It was at this point that Darty showed up in the workshop with a loud pop, startling everyone there. Nick recovered first, however, and immediately locked his gaze on the thing held in the house elf's left hand. It was a dimly glowing gem that was black in color and seemed to have a nebulous swirl of dirty gray energy within it. Is that the remains? He asked calmly. Darty wasted no time handing the gem over to Nick and answering, Yes, master, the arrows you gave me worked flawlessly to dispatch the foul creature. The house elf said with a shudder. Nick noticed this and could easily figure out that the death of the Letherfold was likely an unpleasant experience for Darty. Good work, Darty. Rest up for a couple days, and I'll call you again for help soon, Nick said with a pleased smile and some praise which was like stimulant for the house elf. As a species, house elves live to serve, and so praise made them beyond happy when they got it. Darty vanished from the room before Ron piped up. Did anyone else notice that house elf was wearing fine clothes? He asked, clearly doubting his eyes. I think we all did, but I am more interested in what that stone is he's holding, Daphne said, while pointing at the small gem in Nick's hand. This is just the remains of a Letherfold, nothing that interesting, Nick said casually, while placing the gem into the realm to be analyzed. Aren't those immortal? Hermione asked with a confused expression. Indeed they are, but I figured out how to kill evil immortal creatures like that and sent my servant to dispatch one of the things so I could obtain its remains, Nick explained, since the information was bound to become common soon enough. What sort of magic did you use? Can I learn it too? Hermione asked a couple questions eagerly, but Nick held up a hand to stop her. First is that it is a magic that came from me personally. Second, I have no intention of sharing it at this time, since not even I know the full potential it holds, and it's very rough around the edges, he explained, and the girl deflated unhappily. Forget all that. What's this immortal business she mentioned? Is that like immortality? Ron asked, clearly stuck on that idea. It's not talked about all that much, but basically, there is roughly 4 states of existence that a creature could fit into. Mortal is, of course, well understood by everyone, so I won't talk about that. Immortal is also understood by everyone fairly well, so I also won't speak on that either. The final 2, however, is where things get interesting, as they are hard to fully understand. There is partial immortality, in which one simply won't die unless certain conditions are met first. These conditions could be any number of things, so we would never leave if I had to explain the intricate parts of this. The final form, however, is immortality, which cannot die in normal cases, as it was never alive to begin with. Dementors, poltergeists, and Letherfold fall into these categories, Nick explained calmly. 354. Chapter 354. Pa Voldemort. I was confused more and more the deeper I dug into the Ravenclaw brat's history and background, as it didn't seem to make any sense at all. First, the boy seemed to appear out of nowhere with heavy injuries and amnesia, and none of the Muggles thought to get him medical attention beyond a call-in doctor. This was the first strangeness he found about the boy, but definitely not the last, by any stretch of the imagination. The one that made the least amount of sense to me, though, was that when the boy showed his exceptional talent, not one Muggle found it odd at all. It didn't make any sense at all, so I immediately jumped to magic as the cause, but none of the Muggles had even a single whiff of magical influence on them at all, despite giving them close inspection. It frustrated me to no end how elusive any deeper understanding of this mere child avoided me. In the end, after failing to get anywhere, after searching every known avenue of history, that the boy had not in the wizarding world, I could only shelve the matter for the moment. Once I did that, I finally turned my attention to the state of my forces and frowned in displeasure at what I found. Many of my followers had played a few small tricks to avoid getting sent to Azkaban once I fell, but had failed to seek me out in all this time or hold sway over the Isles. It was disappointing to say the least, as I had assumed many would have at least held my reign over the Isle steady in my absence for a few years, but they had folded without hesitation. I was most displeased with this, but knowing they were facing that old man, I could understand their actions. Dumbledore was no base foe that could be avoided for long without a power equal to his to confront him with. None of my servants had such power, which I admit may have been my own doing to some degree. I was loath to share my hard-earned knowledge with the fools that lacked the drive to improve. Severus, my trusted spy, was different than all the others, as he too was half-blooded such as myself and strived for greatness. Bellatrix and Barty Crouch Jr. were also worthy to be my most faithful followers, as they strove to please me and bring my grand vision to life without losing faith even after my fall. Alas, only Bellatrix remained alive, as Azkaban claimed Barty suspiciously fast for a man of such potent will, which made me think he may have been purposefully killed. I had long decided that I needed to rescue my followers from that prison, but the time was not right yet, and the Dementors were proving difficult to sway. This didn't surprise me, since they weren't very smart creatures to begin with, and were content to eat the happiness of the prisoners in Azkaban. Still, like any population set on a limited ration diet, there were a few individuals that were dissatisfied with the fact they were not allowed to feast freely. These few individuals were easy to convince to serve me, and through them, I was slowly extending my grasp over the entire population. That reminded of an annoying fact. I was recently made aware of that proved to be headache-inducing from how concerning it was. Apparently, the brat created a new form of magical crafting that had the power to erase my own dark marks. Severus had tried to study this new subject and unfortunately suffered the loss of his mark as a result. Rather than give him a new one, as he asked, I instead branded the mark upon an item that he could hide from the old man, unlike the mark. This allowed him to serve even better at spying on the foolish headmaster as well as the brat. Still, the brat was growing more and more troublesome the longer he was left alone, and needed to be slowed down before I can no longer easily dispatch him. Normally, the thought that a mere child could cause me any for of trouble would be insulting at best, but that was unfortunately the truth. I am not foolish enough to dismiss a potential problem after it has repeatedly caused me trouble already, after all. The problem I had was that unfortunately the boy didn't have many openings by which I could attack easily without revealing myself to the world. The few weaknesses that he did have were all very well protected without a single exception, which led me to having to use the muggles he's interacted with as bait. 355. Chapter 355. Nick had spent the last 2 days analyzing the remains of the Letherfold to hopefully figure out how the creatures operated. Even with the realm's help, this proved horrible complicated, as many of the answers he got were paradoxical in nature and made little sense at all. See, the realm's analysis said that the energy in the gem both existed and did not at the same time, while simultaneously being both alive and dead as well. Nick was confused, to say the least, because he couldn't figure out how any of that worked without creating a singularity. Singularities were a theoretical magical phenomena that were created by true paradoxes, such as going back in time and killing your previous self. In theory, if you did this, then you simultaneously failed to do this as well, because you couldn't go back in time to kill your previous self if you were already dead before you did so. This never-ending cycle of succeeding and failing at the same time is a theoretical singularity. According to the realm, this gem is a singularity into itself that is somehow tied to the world, and thus existed in it while also not at the same time. Needless to say, even thinking about it gave Nick a headache, so he dropped any hope of understanding it for now. Waking up on Saturday, he got dressed in some casual wizarding clothes before speaking Darty. He called out, and with a loud pop. The house elf appeared in the common room. "Take me to Diagon Alley," he commanded, and his servant eagerly moved to fulfill his will. Nick got more than a few strange looks when he first arrived in the densely populated and active alley, but he ignored them. He entered a true alley between two buildings and conjured up a full-length mirror from a wall. Once he could see his full body, he tapped his wand against his chest and slowly and methodically worked to transfigure his own body into an adult form. Human transfiguration was a complex and difficult process, even on someone else, but using it on oneself was even more so. Still, Nick merely needed a little more effort than normal to pull it off. When he was done, he stood at 6 feet 2 inches and had a narrow but toned body that was covered in plain black robes. For his face, he simply changed his eye color to blue and adjusted his features to be larger and more narrow, giving himself a shifty look. His hair was removed entirely for this transfiguration, and he even went so far as to add scars to his face. All in all, he looked like he belonged in Nocturne Alley, so he figured no one should bat an eye at him. Walking out of the alley, Nick joined the flow of foot traffic until he reached the entrance to the notorious alley, at which point he walked into it. There was an almost immediate shift in the tone and feel of his surroundings, as if he had walked into a dungeon all of a sudden. He knew what it was from two, as his magical senses picked up the intense dark powers of the various cursed or evil objects within the stores and houses that lined the sides of Nocturne Alley. This wasn't to say that there weren't normal or positive magical signatures as well, but the number of the dark ones far outnumbered those. The people in the alley also had fearful or predatory gazes about them that showed Nick that he needed to stay on his toes. You are a new face in these parts, so you must not know that there is a toll to pass through this area. Nothing major, only a mere 12 galleons. A man with dirty hair and many broken teeth said with a greedy smile. Nick merely pointed at the man with his left hand, and a gout of flames leapt from his fingers and consumed the man before he could even scream, leaving not even ashes behind. Those watching this from nearby, hoping for a good show, immediately turned away and acted as if nothing happened fearfully. No one thought about getting the auras involved at all, as scenes like this weren't uncommon, and no sane aura would willingly come to this place. Nick coldly continued walking, as he had made his stance on moving against him clear. Had the man not reeked of foul magic and blood, Nick might have hesitated to kill him, but he did so. There was no reason to have mercy. Despite that, though, he felt disgusted by the thought of killing, and held on to that feeling knowing that it was all that stopped him from taking the last step into evil wizarding territory. 356. Chapter 356. Every person he killed is a unique thing within the world that will never return to it, and that was valuable. Once that loses value, then nearly everything does as well, and you start to slip into the cold ways of evil wizards. It may not be immediate, and may even take quite some time, but eventually, the how you obtain favorable results will start to matter less than the results themselves. It was one of the reasons Nick disliked Dumbledore so much, as he was starting to care less about the how compared to the end results. This was how his, for the greater good, mindset worked, and was unpleasant to say the least. Anyways, Nocturne Alley was a dark and dreary place with poorly maintained buildings that had various discolorations of their outside walls and rust on their metal signs. Contrary to what the books would have one believe, Borgin and Burke's was not the biggest or most eye-catching store in the alley. The truth was that it was merely the largest store that was near the entrance exit of Nocturne Alley. Nick didn't enter that particular store, as he only felt a single interesting magical item in the store, and it wasn't a creature part. It should be understood, like moving about with a transfigured body was uncomfortable to say the least, so Nick wanted nothing more than to complete his business in this place as fast as possible. While he walked deeper into the alley, he felt someone approaching him from behind from his right side with their left hand stiff in front of them. A pickpocket, huh? Let's give him a bit of a scare. Nick thought, and casually tapped the tip of his wand on his robe the moment the person bumped into him. Oh, sorry, Abu. What the hell? The hooded man started before panicking when he realized he couldn't take his hand out of Nick's pocket, which was also empty, by the way. Nick wasn't planning on killing the thief, however, as he had no magical taint from dark magic, and thus likely wasn't that bad of a person. This was quite the accomplishment for someone in Nocturne Alley. Now, what would a person that has never used dark magic be doing within this place? Nick asked calmly while ignoring the man's repeated attempts to escape from his transfigured pocket. What does it matter? You'll just kill me either way. The thief said bitterly once he figured out that it was impossible to escape. Nick smirked. How's about you and I make a deal? The terms are simple. You satisfy my curiosity, and in exchange, I will let you go without any injuries or messy surprises. Interested? He asked like a demon making a tempting offer. How do I know you will honor your end of the deal? The man asked suspiciously. Nick's smirk grew wider. You don't exactly have much choice but to take my word for it, do you? He asked with a chuckle. The man ground his teeth angrily for a moment before speaking again. Fine. What do you want to know? He asked in defeat. First answer my original question, then we will go from there. Nick said calmly. I am a muggle-born wizard, so when I received my Hogwarts letter, my parents and I were rather surprised. I am not all that talented at magic, if I'm being honest. Barely average, in fact. Anyways, I was fascinated with magic despite this, and after graduating, I spent the next 5 years traveling around the world to see all the different magics of the world. He paused for a moment. Nick knew the plot twist must be coming up thanks to this pause, as people tend to only stop when they need a moment to collect themselves mid-speech. Anyways, about a year ago, I met what I thought was a wonderful woman that took my breath away in more than one way it turned out. In hindsight, I should have known there was something wrong with the situation when she actually showed interest in me despite me not being very attractive. As it turned out, that woman was a vampire belonging to one of the clans that operated in Sweden and turned me in my sleep after I slept with her. Ever since then, I have needed to turn to thievery just to afford the cost of blood in order to survive. The man finally finished his story, and Nick actually pitied the poor guy. Vampires were cursed beings that, while unaging, pay a heavy price for it. First, they must drink magical blood to sustain themselves, which without hunting is obviously very pricey. Second is the agony they have upon any sunlight touching their skin, which explained why the man was so well covered. 357. Chapter 357. The final and frankly largest downside to the condition, however, came in the form of them losing nearly all access to conventional magic after they are turned. It isn't so much as it cut the connection between them as the mana in their bodies stop flowing through their circuits, but rather now saturate their blood itself. Without using one's magical circuits, it was very hard to use normal magic, thus the general inability to perform magic in the vampire population. The nature of the magical change wasn't very dramatic, all things considered, so Nick hadn't actually noticed that the man was a vampire until now. In fact, the change was so minute that his casual glance at the man's magic with his senses hadn't even registered it. Vampirism wasn't all bad news, though, as there were in fact several perks to the condition. First was, of course, how you stop aging at all, and thus can in theory live forever. The second was that the physical abilities of vampires were very much superhuman, whether it be senses, strength, reflexes, or healing. The final perk was that thanks to their magic flowing through their blood, vampires had access to a unique form of magic known as blood magic. Blood magic was, frankly speaking, broken on so many different levels that it wasn't even funny. Depending on age, diet, practice, and a few other factors, each vampire's blood magic was different and unique to themselves. I only have a few more questions before you are free to go, and I may even have an offer for you depending on your answers. Nick said calmly, which caught the man off guard. First is if you have ever killed anyone to satisfy your hunger. Nick asked simply. What? No, why would I ever do something like that when buying blood works fine? The man got upset at the question. Nick nodded before asking his next question. How familiar are you with crafting, specifically enchanting and smithing? He asked calmly. Ah, not very, I suppose. Like I took ancient runes in Hogwarts, but I barely passed it. The man answered with clear confusion. If you were given a chance at a fairly normal life, and even great power in exchange for servitude, would you take it? Nick asked seriously. The man was astonished at the question, but sank into thought about it for an entire minute. Define servitude, he eventually said suspiciously. If you are told to jump, you ask how high, and are not allowed to ignore any order that is within reason, but are otherwise free to do as you wish. Nick said seriously while staring the man down. If that's the case, I'd say it sounds like a damned good deal. So what's the catch exactly? The man asked suspiciously. The catch is that you will serve for a very long time, if not indefinitely. Nick said, making sure to emphasize the word very so the man got the idea. Are you some sort of vampire yourself or something? The man asked, suspicious and on guard. Or something would be correct, so interested in taking that deal. Nick asked, while releasing the transfiguration on his pocket, letting the man go. You'll need to give me a few days to get my matters in order, but if it means a shot at normalcy, then you've got yourself a deal. Name's Lucas, by the way. The man said while holding out his hand for a handshake. Nick took the handshake. Nicholas, when you're ready, head over to Diagon Alley and send a letter to Phileas Flitwick at Hogwarts that asked him to get in touch with the Ringmaker. He'll understand. He said seriously before handing over 50 galleons to the man. Probably don't need to say it, but if you get any funny ideas about this money, besides keeping yourself fed and sending that letter, I will track you down, and you won't like how that will go, am I clear? He asked while pressuring the man with his mana and spiritual energy. Crystal, the man says, while shivering in fear under the tyrannical power flared up at him. Good, off you go then. Nick said as he fully retracted his power just as fast as he released it. The man fled the area immediately, but Nick ignored his hurry. It's a good thing that this place is mostly abandoned at the moment, or that whole event would have been seen by others. Still, I needed a good assistant for my long-term plans, and who better than a vampire that will live just as long as I do? Nick thought before walking away in a pleased mood. 358. Chapter 358. Nick didn't make any detours as he walked, and soon reached his destination in the form of a small run-down-looking shack hidden between two houses. If you didn't know any better then, you might assume that this was merely a shed for storing things outside your house. Nick found out about this place, thanks to Hagrid not being able to keep his mouth shut if plied with good booze and in good company. It might be a cheap trick, but it worked well, so Nick wasn't above using it to get what he needed. Opening the door to the shack, Nick saw the thick layer of dust and cobwebs that covered the otherwise empty build, and ignored them to walk to the back wall and pulled on a rusty nail sticking out. The back wall swung open, revealing a hidden location where the black market was truly found. There was actually two black markets in Nocturne Alley, this one that sold the rarest and most heavily illegal of things, and the open one at the end of the alley that only sold the petty illegal items that the ministry couldn't care less about. The later of which was prone to getting raided by the auras as a show of might that the ministry used to look good. The true black market was a lively place filled with all sorts of smells, sights, and had a sort of low din from everyone talking to each other alongside the illegal creatures in the market. The sentry that was posted at the entrance to look for auras took one look at Nick before ignoring him, as he clearly was not. Nick walked slowly through the aisle that was lined with stalls on both sides, selling all sorts of things. It was no surprise to Nick to see several places selling the magical parts from rare or endangered species. He was rather picky, however, and ignored most of this stuff in hopes of finding something really good. Thanks to his system, he didn't need to be worried about someone here falsely labeling their goods, as he could see the true descriptions of them. He had quite the lucky break when he was reaching the end of the market, as a description appeared that caught his immediate attention. The item was a very old glass jar with preservative fluid in it that had a single egg floating within it, labeled Horned Serpent Egg from Greece. Hydra egg dead. A hydra egg recovered from an ancient Greek wizard's tomb by grave robbers and mistaken for a horned water serpent egg. The embryo has long since run out of vitality and died, but has otherwise been preserved thanks to the special potion it is stored in. 45 for that egg. Nick said calmly to the merchant that was hidden behind a foggy visage illusion. 65, the merchant said under a voice-changing spell. 50, Nick countered. 60, the merchant said calmly. 55, Nick spoke firmly, and the merchant remained silent for a moment before agreeing. Nick took out the agreed-upon sum of galleons and set them down on the stall's counter, and after being counted the merchant waved their hand, at which point Nick picked up the jar and stored it away in the realm. No more words were exchanged between them as Nick turned and left the stall immediately. With his objective complete, Nick slowly browsed through the items being sold in the market, but besides an ancient book written in a lost language, he didn't find anything worth his time or money. He left the black market at this point and made his way out of Nocturne Alley as well. Once back in Diagon Alley, he found a hidden place before releasing his transfiguration, returning him to his normal form. Darty. He called, and his ever-faithful house elf appeared. "Take me back to Hogwarts." Nick commanded, and like that his trip to Nocturne Alley was officially over with. Meanwhile, back at the black market, someone else was not having a very good time as the thing they had been saving money for suddenly got sold to another person. If Nick was still there, he would be surprised to see that it was the woman who had a familiar bond with a genuine horned water serpent from the pageant. Damn it. These last few weeks have been such a pain in the ass. First, I just had to run into him of all people in the pageant that he won because of whatever the hells that creature was. Then, to top it all off, the ancient Hydra egg I was going to use to help my sweet Styre evolve had been snatched the very day I could afford it. The woman was complaining to herself. 359. Chapter 359. Nick was obviously unaware of all of this, of course, but even if he knew, he wouldn't have done anything different. He spent the next few days relaxing in between his enchantments of the rings of protection that had more than doubled per day. That was if he focused all of his time on the things, though, which he was not, but he maintained his daily output of 240 rings. At 10 points, a pop Nick was rapidly racking up points that he was saving for a rainy day. To be more specific, he was waiting until he absolutely needed to use them in order to make sure he didn't find himself in the awkward position of needing something and being unable to get it. During this time, Ron had made a request for Nick to make him a ring that copied books and imprinted the knowledge into his head so that he didn't need to study anymore. Do you think that if I could do something like that, I would need to study myself? Of course not. Each of my enchantments are rigid in structure and only perform in roughly the way I design them to, not to mention complex enchantments like the sort you are asking for are beyond me at the moment. Nick explained, irritated. Look, the fact is that as much as I would like to craft lovely little shortcuts like that, I can't because of the limitations I am under. Believe me, I had thought about doing exactly that multiple times, but learning and memory are extremely complex subjects, so I can't just add a quick smarts enchantment to things without possibly causing the person using it to melt their brain. Nick vented his grievances about the matter freely. This wasn't to say he didn't still love his crafting style, merely that he was frustrated by the limitations it had on it. Nick got over that brief bout of irritation quickly, though, and got back to relaxing. At the end of this period, he finally received the portkey from the ministry in the form of an old torn-up-looking glove. Looks like it's time to head into orbit and set up my collectors, he thought after testing the portkey. While it was unlikely, there always existed a small possibility that someone would mess with his order and have him sent to a dangerous area instead of Hogsmeade. He snuck out of the castle the next day and into the forbidden forest under the disillusionment charm. He did this because he didn't want Dumbledore to know about his trip out of the world that would definitely bring questions he didn't want to answer. Creating new magical creatures was strictly illegal, and doing it on accident, such as with Nazgul versus intentionally with the Atronach Forge, were very different things. The Forge was originally only going to operate on his island, but now that he had the realm, he was going to use it there instead. Putting on the space suit he made previously, Nick took out the special broom he made and mounted it. Very slowly, he eased it out of the tops of the trees of the forest before nervously taking a deep breath and shooting straight up on the broom. Even with the air resistance enchantments, it took every ounce of Nick's strength to hold onto the broom as he rapidly gained altitude. It took him an entire hour to fully breach the Earth's gravity and finally hit orbit. The spells on the suit worked automatically, and he had air to breath, while the vacuum around him was kept at bay. He didn't stop, however, as he rose higher and higher until he finally hit the area around the planet that things tended to float and orbit the planet. He wasn't surprised to find that he couldn't see any of these floating things from here as compared to the size of the planet, They were tiny. He was mesmerized by the view, though as it was hard to describe just how beautiful it was to see the Earth from such an angle. After admiring the view for 10 minutes and literally watching the world turn, slowly he got to work setting his collectors in place. He didn't just toss them out haphazardly, though, but rather placed one before flying a long distance away with his broom and placing another one. He did this until he had all 7 set in a peculiar orbit, like the electrons of an atom. With those circling the globe like this, they should collect the majority of the star metal near the planet within a month, at which point I will be back up here to collect my spoils. He thought before activating the portkey and vanishing from space. 360. Chapter 360. Nick failed to take something in mind when he used the portkey, however, that made his appearance in Hogsmeade very loud. See, when a wizard or other creature apparate the loud pop. That is heard comes from the air getting displaced as they take off and land. Since portkeys operate on roughly the same principle, the surroundings are affected by the travel based on what they were. This meant that when Nick used the portkey in the vacuum of space, a piece of that vacuum came with him. The moment he landed in Hogsmeade, the air was pushed out of that spot before being sucked in because of the vacuum filling itself. The sudden conflicting pressure caused the pop to get much louder than normal, drawing attention to him. Nick immediately cast disillusionment on himself seeing this, while cursing himself mentally for not realizing that it would have happened. Thankfully, the dozen or so people that saw him in his spacesuit only caught a brief glance before he vanished. He was sure that they wouldn't be able to make out any meaningful details in that tiny time frame and quickly fled to Hogwarts. He was correct, of course, that no one learned about what exactly it was that they saw, but he would soon have a different headache to deal with. Nick had already changed his clothes before he got back to the school, so no one found anything off about him. Disillusionment may work on the average population of wizards, but Nick wasn't stupid enough to not know that the staff at the school would be able to see past it easily. Much to his surprise, however, he was found by McGonagall almost immediately and told that he needed to speak to Dumbledore on a grave matter immediately. What could have happened in such a short period of time? He wondered in confusion, as from what he could tell, there shouldn't have been any events that would require his presence in a mere few hours. He was wrong. Once he got into the headmaster's office, he was surprised to see 3 auras standing there with serious expressions. Dumbledore noticed his entry immediately. "Mr. Ravenclaw is here now, so one of you should inform him as to why his presence is required," the old man said seriously, and a blonde-haired male aura walked over to Nick. "There is a situation going on at the moment by which a group of muggles has been taken hostage. The criminal is unidentified, but has already put forward their demands, namely the turning over of one Nicholas Ravenclaw, unarmed and restrained," the aura explained sternly. Nick's expression underwent a series of changes in a short period of time, from shocked to disbelief, and finally settling on cold fury. Where are they located, and who exactly are the hostages in question? He asked neutrally while clamping down on his emotions using occlumency. "A field in Little Hangleton, and according to what we have discovered, every muggle you had contact with before receiving your Hogwarts letter," another aura with brown hair said helplessly. "So the kidnappers chose a spot that prevents ambush and tried to take hostages I may consider trading myself for. This is not the sort of thing someone familiar with me would attempt, as they would know that while it would pain me to do so, I would abandon the muggles, since I am more valuable than them." Nick thought, and started going through as many possible identities of people that would try something like this. "This must be the work of that noseless bastard," he said once he figured it out. Frankly speaking, the list of people he has offended to the point of such an action, or had motive to do this, could be counted on one hand and half. That number was dead or imprisoned. As a result, it was easy to deduce that this was Voldemort's idea, as the man had a serious grudge, and so little information on him that only he would make such a stupid move. Dumbledore's eyes widened when he heard what Nick said, while the auras were all sharing a confused look. "Who are you referring to exactly?" the blonde aura asked curiously. Nick shook his head. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Give me a few days to think it over," he said seriously. We were given a week to hand you over as of this morning, so that is all we can afford you, I'm afraid. The aura said apologetically. That will be more than enough. Nick said ominously before leaving the office to prepare to dispose of a problem once and for all. 361. Chapter 361. Nick had chosen to ignore Voldemort after destroying all the item Horcruxes, since no matter what, the man was doomed to stagnation after losing so much of his soul permanently. His return merely meant that he might make a nuisance of himself, a bit earlier than in canon in Nick's opinion, but obviously he was wrong. Add on his purifying and evil-destroying soul shot arrows, and the man was hardly even much of an irritation, since he was easy to kill. As a result, Nick frankly didn't care about him after giving Harry the sunlight dagger that was suppressing the soul shard within his forehead. After this stunt, though, that guy needs to go for good. Nick thought as he went into the workshop and turned on the furnace. He grabbed a bar of dragon steel and tossed it into the furnace to melt, while he transfigured a mold in the shape of a thin chain. Once the metal was melted, he waved his wand to extract it from the furnace cleanly and flow into the mold. His plan for dealing with Voldemort was quite simple, really. First was that he needed to get past the man's caution by truly stripping himself of all magical items. Voldemort was definitely aware of the tricky nature of Nick's enchantment method, and thus had definitely had the unarmed stipulation applied to the rings on him. What he didn't know, however, was that the ring that held Nick's realm was literally impossible to keep separated from him, as he could summon it from wherever it may be. Such was the nature of a realm that its owner was unable to ever be truly separated from it while their soul still existed. Weak though it may currently be, Nick's realm was no different. After Voldemort's subordinate captures him, Nick planned to summon his ring and drag Voldemort into it, as the arrogant prick was likely to try and gloat about his victory. Once inside the realm, the fate of the flawed Lick was sealed, as Nick had access to everything within it that he will store beforehand. This included his wand, the many soul shot arrows, all his protective items, and finally this chain he was forging. This chain will work to delay Voldemort long enough for the soul shot arrows to strike true. The way it will accomplish this is thanks to the individual rings that make up the chain being enchanted to block mana flow with those in contact with it. By linking each of these small, weak enchantments of the same kind together, Nick theorized that this should make the resulting effect just barely strong enough to seal Voldemort's mana flow for a few moments, but definitely no longer than 10 seconds. He was helpless about this matter, as at the moment, he simply lacked the required power to forge a true Archmage-level magical artifact in one go, and stable enchantments can't be built upon with the Celebrimber style. In truth, this chain was the highest level of magical artifact he was capable of at the moment that didn't require time or effect to grow to that point. The anklet of rings on his leg was currently the most powerful artifact he had on hand, as it had been storing energy with each step he took since he put it on last year. Even then, it barely reached Archmage levels of power, which is to say it would be irresistible by anything not on that level, and Archmages would struggle to resist its effects. The reason Nick wanted a few days was not to prepare, as he was pretty much set on this matter already, but rather to get Lucas situated on Ravenclaw Island in the manor. Thankfully, he could take care of the peculiar needs of his newest servant easily, as he simply needed to put the magical blood fountain enchantment using Daedric runes to good use with a little tweaking. He wanted to change the enchantment to cause the blood to only be created from the mana when the container was empty, while also making sure the blood was the best quality possible for a vampire, which meant it needed to be dragon blood. This, as an added downside, however, meant that Nick needed to incorporate a mimicry enchantment that caused the blood created to all be whatever blood the enchantment was exposed to previously, in this case, dragon's blood. Tweaking the enchantment was what truly took Nick these next few days, as he set the enchantment on a ring that he placed into a drinking flask, along with a drop of Norwegian Ridgeback blood, to get the enchantment started. 362. Chapter 362. Since the enchantment was made using only Daedric runes, rather than using the Celebrimber style of enchantment, Nick needed to carefully carve out each, and every rune with the correct intent and position. This took him about 2 days, since he wanted to get it in a single go rather than make small mistakes and rush it. Still, he finished it up, and just in time too, as that same day Flitwick approached him about a strange letter he had received. Nick thanked him for the dealing with the inconvenience and summoned Darty right away so that they could go and retrieve Lucas. The vampire in question was hanging around the entrance to Nocturne Alley nervously after sending that letter. He found it a bit odd that the clearly powerful man that he had met previously would need to go through a professor at Hogwarts to get a letter, but could only shrug it off as the eccentricities of a powerful wizard. In truth, Nick only had Lucas go through such a roundabout method so that his name wouldn't accidentally slip if someone asked where he was going after getting his affairs in order. Nick simply didn't want to deal with the irritation of fending off people seeking to hug his thigh with bad intentions. As the only known living Ravenclaw and well-known genius, Nick was a power to be reckoned with both politically as well as economically. He was well aware of this, and had as a result been very careful not to get caught doing something that might sully his reputation. The biggest downside to his family name, though, came in the form of those who thought they could trick him due to his young age, and thus use the Ravenclaw's power for their own use. That was the great thing about taking Lucas under his wing in Nick's opinion, as not only was the man unaging like himself, but he was totally unaware of who he was actually working for at the moment, so his intentions were not suspect. Nick, of course, transfigured himself into his previous disguise before he showed up to grab Lucas. The man practically had his jaw hit the floor after Nick brought him to Ravenclaw Island, and he saw the various magical beasts living there almost undisturbed, and even almost passed out when the ancient manticore named Seram showed up. After getting Lucas settled into the manor with the special flask that the man looked at like a treasure after taking a swig of its contents, Nick went back to Hogwarts to set his plan in motion. The auras had been rotated over the last few days, so it was a different group in the school when Nick went to go find them. He was going to make a suggestion on how to get the hostages back safely, but after learning that Dumbledore was going to personally see to the exchange of people, he held his tongue. Regardless of what Nick might think of the man as a person, he would never deny his power and skill. Nick stored all of his personal effects in the realm before leaving the ring behind in Dumbledore's hands, with a wink to let the old man know he had a plan. The field where the exchange was set to take place was completely flat and wide, with knee-high yellow grass that made any shift from invisible forces visible. All in all, Nick had to admit that it was a perfect place to trade people for a wizard, as unless the Ministry suddenly decided to use a Muggle sniper rifle, the person could easily react to any attack that came their way. When the group appeared at the edge of the field, Nick took the time to sense the magic of the person holding the hostages, but was surprised to find that not only were they not cold or angry at him, but rather seemed almost respectful instead. None of this mattered to Nick so much as the horrible taint that their magic held that was totally inhuman by this point. This mysterious black-cloaked individual had clearly used hideous and vile magics to gain power nearly equal to that of Snape's. The hostage exchange went smoothly with Dumbledore there, and with a loud pop, Nick was forcefully apparated away by the cloaked individual while his hands were tied behind him. Having experienced the method of travel before, Nick didn't stumble much after they landed and was alert to his surrounding. It was a cold and musty room clearly located inside a building and had exactly two other occupants other than Nick and the cloaked person who tossed him away after they landed. One was an exotic snake that looked like a strange mix of python and viper with the size of the former. The other was a pale, veiny, bald man with red eyes and no nose that had a cold smile on his face, Voldemort. 363. Chapter 363. And so it is that we finally meet, the last true descendants of Slytherin and Ravenclaw both in the Isles. If only you hadn't touched that which I hold most precious above all else, perhaps you could have joined me as I built a new world, a better one. Voldemort said, with a faint and raspy voice that gave Nick goosebumps. If nothing else, he could admit that the man was creepy as hell in person. He sensed Voldemort's magic and confirmed the unrepairable taint and decay that filled his sizable mana reserves. "I pity you," Nick said honestly, which caused Voldemort to frown, but wait for an explanation. Born under the effects of a love potion, and thus incapable of feeling it yourself, left in a muggle orphanage where you came to be entranced by your own power and got a taste for domination. Studied at Hogwarts and had a great future ahead of you, only to throw it away for a flawed and pathetic attempt at immortality. Such a waste, Nick explained disdainfully. Anger flashed in Voldemort's red eyes, and he visibly snarled, "Crucio." He pointed his wand at Nick and shouted. Nick felt the spell take hold and send horrible pain through his body, but he quickly forced the magic out with his own. For a normal wizard this was impossible, but for him, he merely needed to put the full force of his soul behind it to reject the magic forcefully. He didn't need a Mediwitch to understand that that brief exposure to the curse was enough to fry a few of his nerves. "So the usual methods won't work on you then. It's a good thing that I anticipated this and prepared accordingly," Voldemort said with a cold sneer after his spell was stopped. He walked over to a nearby table that had been covered with a cloth and removed the covering dramatically. There laid out on the table were various torture devices, all designed to cause as much pain as possible. "I do hate getting my hands dirty, but for you I'll make an exception. Try not to break too soon, won't you?" Voldemort said sadistically as he held a razor and pliers and walked over to within striking distance of Nick. What happened next could be described as chaos, as Nick immediately burned through the ropes binding him with his bloodline magic and summoned his ring to him. Before Voldemort could react, the black formless ring appeared on Nick's pointer finger. He grabbed the man by the wrist, ignoring the razor that was cutting into him from Voldemort's reaction. With another move, both of them vanished into the realm, leaving both Nagini and the cloaked figure in surprise and shock, as it all happened too fast to interfere. Meanwhile, Nick and Voldemort landed unceremoniously inside the realm, but at different locations as per Nick's will. Holding out his left hand, his wand appeared in it, and he shuddered as the connection was re-established before pointing at his wound Episci. He spoke, and the mending charm went to work closing the nasty gash. "Where is this? What have you done?" Voldemort demanded the moment he noticed the wrongness of the surroundings. The sun was tiny. There was no stars or clouds or sky, really, and the curvature of the ground was all wrong, as if the earth was barely the size of a house. "Arda Milmi, or the realm of Avarice if you prefer. A small pocket world belonging to me, and a terrible place for my enemies to find themselves," Nick said calmly, since his victory was guaranteed at this point. Once in the realm, he was basically God, as he could manipulate the fabric of space freely and rearrange the entire realm just as easily. Whatever found itself in the realm was subjected to his laws and rules. With a raise of his hand, hundreds of golden arrows flew from the ground and covered the space overhead in an instant as they all aimed at Voldemort. "Relish in your short-lived victory while you can brat, for I shall return to exact my vengeance," Voldemort said angrily after realizing that his situation was hopeless. Nick laughed at that for a moment before explaining to the man that these arrows don't only destroy the body, but also the soul and magic, meaning there was no future resurrection for him. Voldemort screamed and raged in fear and anger after hearing this, but Nick coldly dropped his hand, and the hundreds of arrows descended upon the flawed lick. Voldemort struggled in vain with any spell he could think of, including fiend fire, but all proved helpless before the soul-shot arrow rain. 364. Chapter 364. Nick didn't waste the power of Voldemort, though after his death, as once it had been purified by the arrows attacking it, he was left with roughly half of the original mana that dispersed into the realm freely. Thanks to this, the ambient mana was now just barely below the level it was in Hogwarts. Nick took his time, rearming himself with all his protective artifacts, as well as his wand, and then left the realm ready to fight it out with Nagini and the cloaked figure. However, to his great surprise, Nagini was already dead, and the cloaked figure was not alone in the room. A middle-aged-looking man with short white hair and two different eye colors stood there with a gentle smile as the cloaked figure was kneeling behind him. Nick froze at the sight of this, and paled immediately since he recognized the man from old news clippings printed over 50 years ago. Gellert Grindelwald was here. "Calm yourself, child. Neither I nor my associate mean you any harm." The Dark Lord spoke softly, but with an authority that was hard to ignore. Nick did not relax, however, but was readying every defensive artifact he had on him. Grindelwald merely sighed after seeing this. "It is good that you are cautious, as that is a trait that will take you far in life. But if I wanted to harm you," Grindelwald spoke, but paused briefly as he waved his hand, and his features blurred like mud, and rearranged themselves into a face Nick had gotten very familiar with over the summer, Mr. Crumont. "I had plenty of opportunities," he finished saying with a new voice. "So that's why they can't seem to find out where you are hiding from." Nick exclaimed in realization. Grindelwald cancelled his transfiguration and chuckled. "Yes, I have been operating right under their noses this whole time. It was disappointingly easy, to be honest with you, with how horribly inefficient the auras are after receiving such a pitiful amount of funding. I can't say that it wasn't a good move from Fudge in the beginning, as the community truly needed the funds elsewhere, but his mistake was not fixing the funding after his goals were met. Did you know that not a single aura even checked the restaurant at all during this whole time? It's disappointing, to say the least," he said casually. "Why are you here? Why reveal your hiding place to me now specifically?" Nick asked, confused. "Because the time was right, of course," Grindelwald said, motioning to his silver eye. "I saw this scenes leading up to this moment months ago and began orchestrating things to fall perfectly into place while I worked towards my grand goal. First, I placed my associate by that man's side and had him slowly influence Voldemort's decisions until he finally brought about his own doom, or I assume that is the case since he never reappears in this world after today," he explained honestly. "So you can't see within that place then?" Nick said, understanding the clues he was being given. "That place is a world unto itself, and so its fate is separate to this world's, and thus outside of my sight. Besides, it is not as though I always see the future with this eye, merely that it grants me the occasional glimpse of what will come, or what may come. It is why I left my confinement in Nurmengard, you know. I saw the future that you may bring about, and wish to aid you in this regard," Grindelwald explained warmly. "My only dream for as long as I can remember was to see wizard kind set free from this self-imposed prison we have created, and to truly influence the world. Sadly, the methods I chose previously would have failed even if I won that duel, a fact I learned only a year after the event. The terms of my incarceration were quite ironclad in that I was not allowed to leave if I held any thoughts on ruling when the dust settles. But why would I lead wizards forward when a far better option already existed? You ask me why I revealed myself to you now earlier. The answer is because my work in Europe has finished, and so it is time I leave this place until the rest is finished. Before I left, however, I wish to speak with you without any disguises. It is at this point, however, that I will bid you adieu for now, as Albus shall be arriving momentarily," Grindelwald said before he and the cloaked figure vanished with a loud pop. Just as the man said, Dumbledore appeared in a blaze of fire with Fawkes, while his wand was at the ready. 365. Chapter 365. "You are late, it seems. You just missed Grindelwald," Nick said tiredly, causing Dumbledore to have a disoriented look. He came here thinking that he would be fighting Voldemort, but instead all the enemies were gone, and apparently Grindelwald was here for some weird reason. So it was quite understandable that he was rather lost at the moment. Nick wasted no time at all explaining what had happened in the brief period that they had been separated, and even supplying Voldemort's wand as proof. "So it is truly over with then. I suppose a celebration is in order then. Just amongst those aware of his return, though," Dumbledore said with a smile. "Before that, though, I could use a bit of help from Madame Pomfrey to fix my nerves. The evil bastard used the Cruciatus curse on me and fried a few of them," Nick said, while showing his twitchy and unsteady hands. As a craftsman, Nick knew the importance of having steady hands, and as a result wanted the damage fixed as soon as possible. Dumbledore nodded seriously, and Fawkes teleported both of them back to Hogwarts through the special method only phoenixes could. Madame Pomfrey was horrified to learn that Nick had been subjected to the Cruciatus, and had him take 4 potions, and stay the next 3 days in bed within the hospital wing. Meanwhile, Dumbledore somehow managed to get Nick an Order of Merlin third-class medal for bravery and self-sacrifice that made the headlines since he was the youngest person to ever get a medal. The truth of the story was that he was already pretty close to earning a medal with his corporeal ghost's rings, and this last incident with him giving himself up to save the hostages pushed him into truly earning it. Only the Order of the Phoenix members, and a few others such as Harry and Nick's friends, knew that Voldemort was truly gone, though. Once Nick was released from the hospital wing, and his nerves had been fully repaired and acclimated to his body, he went to work immediately on creating a ring for Lucas that restored his magic to the way it was before he became a vampire, as well as had a few extra perks attached. It was ironic to Nick that the book he had gotten so long ago from the system on Tamrelic vampires, Immortal Blood, was now very useful to him. See, the book gave details on the abilities of several different clans of vampires from that world, and after spending a few hundred system points, he got some extra information as well that solidified the ring enchantment he was going to make in his mind. Obviously, no assistant of his should be ordinary, so Nick was going to boost Lucas's vampiric abilities to a frankly scary level. Cold manipulation from the Volkihar clan, mist form from the Kirillth, sun resistance from Lamibal. These were the abilities he intended to put on the ring, and thus he needed special preparations to get it done. Lucas was less than happy about needing to donate a few liters of blood each day until it equaled all the blood in his body. Nick used this blood to create a very specific type of blood silver that was tied to Lucas's magic deeply. Once he had enough of the metal, Nick destroyed the remaining blood in disgust, as just making this stuff was uncomfortably close to dark magic. Still, next came the tricky part of the enchantment, where he imbued the abilities of the enchantment. He needed to enlist Flitwick's help with this step, as he needed to take a break for each of the abilities he added to the enchantment. Still, the final result was a thing of beauty, as it was a shiny dark red metal ring that looked like a bat flapping its wings, with the wings connected at the tips to make the band. The stats of the ring were really good too, as the ring was mythical grade and hit all the points he was after. Ring, low re, night crown grade, mythical abilities, auto-sizing, core flow, sun resistance, cold manipulation, mist form, bound, Lucas, growth mythical ability, blessing of the bat, grants the wearer the ability to transform into a bat at will. Description, a grand creation made to grant great power to vampire servant. System appraisal, a complex ring that will change history and carve its name in myth created by an established ring smith. Flitwick was surprised to learn that his old student Lucas had become a vampire during his travels, and thanked Nick for taking him under his wing, even if it was as a servant, as he knew how badly vampires were treated normally. 366. Chapter 366. Nick had no reason to keep Lucas's employ hidden from any of the professors, as he knew none of them would spread the information around. If anything, after learning that Lucas became a vampire, they would thank him like Flitwick did. Sad as it may be, they simply didn't have the resources needed to make sure every student that passes through their classrooms have a good life. Still, this didn't mean that they didn't hope for the best and occasionally lend some aid if they could. With the ring finished, Nick left for Ravenclaw Island without disguising himself this time. Considering it was daytime, still Nick wasn't surprised to find that Lucas was still in the manor, hidden away in his assigned room. "I have some good news for you," Nick said as he walked into the room. It was rather funny to see the confusion on the man's face for Nick, but he figured he should probably explain what is going on. "You work for me now. What you saw previously was merely a disguise that I created for my trip to Nocturne Alley. My full name is Nicholas Iron Ravenclaw," he said with a small bow. Lucas was dumbfounded at this revelation, and it showed, but his experience as an adventurer showed itself as he recovered quickly. "I never agreed to work for a kid still wet behind the ears, so while I like the flask, I'll pass, thanks," he said, clearly thinking Nick was some spoilt rich kid and wanting nothing to do with it. Nick removed the suppressor for his aura and released his magical energy at the same time, and Lucas froze. Contrary to what you may be thinking, I am not wet behind the ears, nor am I some spoiled child. I have worked very hard for the power I currently hold, and as for my fortune, that comes with its own burdens. Am I clear?" he asked, while actively suppressing Lucas. The vampire was shivering in instinctive fear and nodded hurriedly. Elves are very powerful beings, and Nick already had slightly more mana than Lucas did in his body. Add on the weight of how much purer his mana was compared to Lucas, and it was like standing in front of a dragon for the vampire. Resistance was definitely not the first thing that would pop up in a normal person's mind. Nick nodded, satisfied to have gotten this matter settled. "Perhaps you are not aware, thanks to the less than ideal conditions of your life till now, but I am a rather well-known craftsman here in the Isles. For example, I made that flask you enjoy so very much, as well as this ring here," he said, while taking the low ring out of the realm. Lucas's gaze immediately locked onto the ring, as all of his instincts warred against his reason. His instincts told him to snatch the ring away, while his reason reminded him that Nick was not the innocent, weak child he appeared to be. "Once you swear an oath to me, I will not only give you this ring, but I will also teach you my own personal crafting techniques, spells, and even possibly help you increase your own power at an amazing rate," Nick said with a tempting smile, like he was a demon bargaining for a soul. The similarity was also not lost on Lucas as a muggle-born, but he had to admit that he was very, very tempted. "What are the details of this oath exactly?" Lucas asked, while suppressing his instincts that were muddling his mind. "The terms are very simple. First, you are not allowed to share what you learn, hear or see while you work for me knowingly or otherwise. Second, you are not allowed to ignore any order I give you knowingly so long as it is within reason. Finally, you are to truly try your best to learn what I teach you. That's it, simple and clean as promised," Nick explained calmly. Lucas thought about the terms seriously, and he couldn't see any nasty surprises hidden in them, not for lack of trying, mind you. "All right, I can accept those terms, but to be clear, I doubt I will have much talent in regards to crafting," Lucas said honestly. "I didn't decide to take you under me as a servant and assistant because of your talent, but your personality in the face of your terrible situation. When many would have fallen into dark magics and attacking others to survive, you chose the harsher but more pure path of thievery instead. I can't say you didn't have better options, but I know for a fact that they were pretty bad as well," Nick explained honestly. 367. Chapter 367. With that settled, Nick sealed the deal with an unbreakable oath from Lucas, causing a permanent magical tattoo of a black chain to appear on his wrist. Nick tossed the ring to the vampire after that, and Lucas slipped it on his ring finger before staggering in place as it took effect. "Why harm har I so hard tired?" Lucas asked, freaked out while panting heavily. "Because until now all of your mana has been in a single circulatory system, which was your magical circuits, or your blood in the case of vampirism. Thanks to that ring, however, your mana core is now supplying your mana to both at the same time, and so you are operating at half your normal magic at the moment. You'll need a few weeks before your reserves grow to accommodate this increased demand for mana in your body. The good news is that thanks to being able to gain mana from your diet, it is only this long rather than the months to years it may have normally taken," Nick said with a smirk. "Ah, damn it, all this sucks, and I have to deal with it for several weeks at that," Lucas complained after he stabilized his breathing. "It'll get more manageable in time, but for now we should focus on your new bloodline abilities," Nick said with a smirk. "Bloodline abilities?" Lucas asked, confused. He was muggle-born after all, and as such had no such things beyond the single one from being turned. "Oh yes, I probably should have mentioned it, but since I used your blood as an integral part of the creation of that ring, its powers are by extension tied into your bloodline while you wear it. In simple terms, you can at this moment be considered the progenitor of a whole new kind of vampire," Nick explained with a smirk. Lucas was dumbfounded after hearing this, as he knew precisely what that meant after being a vampire for these last few years. Most vampires were part of the original bloodline that had no special powers to it at all. The progenitors of the other bloodlines were originally wizards who had special powers before they were turned, and as such those they turned inherited those powers. These special single specialty bloodlines were called exceeded noble vampires. The ones running the main clans belonged to this category, or the category even higher than that was simply called the royals. Royal vampires were what happened when exceeded noble vampires turned a wizard with different bloodline abilities, already across at minimum 4 different generations. This resulted in a vampire with no less than 5 different bloodline abilities, or a royal as they are called. These titles were unrelated to the ones that a vampire got with age and power, but still had a huge impact in the vampire community. Royal vampires were, as the name might suggest, royalty amongst vampires, and as such held a very large amount of authority. There was at the moment only a single line of royal vampires that had been crowned not very long ago, historically speaking, the Teeps royal line. Created a bit over 500 years ago by none other than Vladimir Teeps himself, the Teeps royals have held dominion over vampire society this entire time. Unfortunately, there was nothing beyond a royal vampire, as after more than 5 abilities are integrated into the bloodline, only 5 will ever manifest in a single vampire. So while in theory, the Teeps royal bloodline has nearly 20 abilities, its members only ever show 5 per member. Lucas was lucky in that the woman who turned him was a born exceeded noble that found him attractive and as such wished to possess him. Yes, one could be born a vampire if the parents were both vampires themselves. In these cases, natural-born vampires then have different ways of seeing the world, with the females being picky about their mates. This sadly meant that when they found someone they approved of, they can turn manipulative and cruel to possess their chosen partner. In Lucas's case, he caught the attention of a vampress, and she manipulated him into eventually sleeping with her, at which point she likely took advantage of his clouded mind from the lust of it to have him drink her blood. After that, all that was left was for her to sink her fangs into him and circulate her blood magic, using the blood he drank as a medium. At that point, she didn't need to hide who or what she was from him. She pretty much was his only real option as far as continuing to live a decently normal life after that, which was the only reason he was cut loose so easily. Eventually, his stubborn refusal to join her will be worn down by the harshness of his living conditions, and she will get her prize, and the years it may take mean nothing to her. 368. Chapter 368. That was, of course, no longer the case, since Nick had basically solved all the problems Lucas would have had at this point, and even elevated his position in the world. He would, after all, be the second person in the world to truly know and understand how to create and enchant things as Nick does. This didn't even begin to include the fact he could be considered a subordinate of House Ravenclaw, and as such, despite being a vampire, was fairly powerful from a political standpoint. That vampress would undoubtedly notice this drastic shift in Lucas's situation from her spies and be furious. Just because she wouldn't mind waiting a few years for Lucas to crumble under the pressure didn't mean that she wasn't keeping an eye on him, since after all it wouldn't do for him to die or take refuge with some other vampire clan. In fact, Nick was certain that she already knew that Lucas had been taken by a wizard and his house elf, and was likely trying to figure out who that wizard was. Jokes on them for not realizing that it was a disguise, Nick thought in amusement. There was honestly no way to connect that form with Nick, as the only outlier was Darty, and distinguishing one house elf from another was stupid difficult. By normal standards, they were ugly creatures with wrinkled skin and huge ears that were all as thin as twigs. They also very rarely were born with easily identifiable features that set them apart from the rest, and it was only in the small details that they could be told apart. Darty, for example, had a set of wrinkles on its face that were unique, which let Nick identify them. So what sort of bloodline abilities do I have now other than that one I already had? Lucas asked curiously. You can turn into mist, control cold to a degree, walk about in the sun freely, and turn into a bat. Out of curiosity, what was your original ability? Nick asked after listing the new abilities. I could breath underwater. It wasn't even all that useful either, since I suck at swimming. Lucas said honestly. A mundane ability to be sure, but an ability nonetheless. Nick said, nodding in understanding. so I can just go for a walk without all this extra fabric and not have to worry about my skin getting covered in blisters in 5 minutes? Lucas asked, double-checking. In theory, that is what it should do, yes, Nick said with a nod. Then you'll have to excuse me for a moment. I have missed feeling the warmth of the sun on my skin dearly over these last few years, Lucas said, and hurriedly removed his thick coat and hood before walking out of his room and into the hallway of the manor. The sun was starting to fall, but there was still plenty of light coming through the windows, so he tentatively held out his hand, half expecting pain, but all he felt was warmth as the sunlight touched his hand. He didn't tear up or anything dramatic like that, but smiled widely before stepping into the light with a comfortable sigh. Nick didn't interrupt him despite wanting to see the other abilities in action to make sure they were as good as he hoped. He was confident that they wouldn't be disappointing at all, but wasn't a big fan of making guesses about stuff like this. Lucas eventually got enough of just standing in the sunlight and remembered that Nick was still there. "Sorry about that. We still needed to go over the other abilities, right?" he asked with an awkward smile. "Cold manipulation, mist form, and bat transformation, to be specific," Nick reminded, and Lucas nodded. Cold manipulation was horribly mana exhaustive, apparently, as Lucas barely tapped into it before his mana reserves plummeted sharply. Mist form was actually horribly broken in Nick's opinion, as Lucas could change specific parts of his body into mist, and was nearly unaffected by both physical attacks as well as most spells. It did have a weakness in the form of dispersal, however, as using magic to kick up a gale scattered the mist temporarily. The bat transformation cost a chunk of mana and turned Lucas into a small crimson-furred bat. Time passed by after that, as Nick held off on teaching Lucas any crafting, but assigned him several books on just pure theory and basics of smithing to study. News arrived verifying what Grindelwald said about him leaving Europe as a town in Africa was sacrificed. By my calculations, I should have roughly 2 years before he starts the reset, and then a few after that, until Zeus shows up with Hephaestus and Hestia. So after I graduate is when I need to start keeping an eye out for the guards. Nick thought seriously. 369. Chapter 369. Nick pretty much left Lucas be for the next month, save the occasional check-in to make sure the vampire wasn't having any issues memorizing the information. During this time period, he had greatly familiarized himself with the enchantment for the rings of protection, to the point, in fact, that he could lightly tap a ring once and complete the enchanting process with only a small amount of his energy lost to power the enchantment. This had caused his daily total to skyrocket from 240 to nearly 500 every day. If his previously made rings were taken into account, Nick estimated that he would only need about a year to meet the bare minimum required for completing the mission. Unfortunately, he knew that this was the absolute fastest he could create the rings, as he was now being held back by his energy reserves. Thankfully, he expected that this problem would be soon rectified during the approaching ritual. With that out of the way, Nick had turned his attention primarily to his studies with great effect. He finished all the 5th-year spell work and was now starting on the 6th year. This wasn't to say that he wasn't much more skilled than a student starting the 6th year, as unlike most, Nick didn't forget the previous year's information to focus on the new stuff. The sad fact was that the Hogwarts curriculum was perfectly designed to create powerful, skilled wizards, but the catch was that for it to work, the students must remember and practice the older knowledge on top of the new stuff. It was like building a tower where the stuff put down was the foundation or base that the rest was built on. By forgetting that stuff, the foundation rotted, thus limiting the height the tower could be built to via conventional methods. Nick, however, focused on keeping his foundation fresh and strong, thus making him better than those with a rotting foundation. The only person in his age group even close to him in terms of foundation was Hermione, as she had an insatiable thirst for knowledge, and studied both higher year knowledge, but even topics simply not taught in the classes. This led her to be absolutely flexible in what she could do per situation she found herself in. The only thing that irritated Nick about her was that she never fully devoted herself to a single subject once she felt she had a good grasp of the basics of it. On the last day of January, though, something changes for Nick that was a momentous occasion. He finally figured out how to put a weak version of any kind of enchantment on an organic material using the Celebrimber style. While this excited him, it also frustrated him to no end, as it was honestly a simply thing he had not thought of until now. See, until this point, he had been thinking of the enchantment as a foreign thing, and as a result, the magic was rejected even if the enchantment was compatible with the material. It was only thanks to a moment of inspiration as he watched Ron eat a sandwich that he figured it out. The ingredients in the sandwich were also not a part of the sandwich originally, but yet worked together to improve the sandwich when brought together. He thus changed his thinking when adding the enchantment and discovered that it barely worked to allow him to place any enchantment he wanted that was weak on any organic material. With this, I am one step closer to enchanting my wand with this style of enchantment as well as the one that makes it work at the moment, Nick thought with a smile. He then focused his attention on improving the strength of the enchantments he could place on organic materials, since he wanted to bring it up to his current standard with metal. Just like before, however, this was very slow going, and he knew it would take a long time or a moment of inspiration to make another breakthrough in this. Celebrimber himself was of no help in any regard for the organic smithing experiments, as he was learning the subject at the same time Nick was. Nick was a worthy successor as far as the old elf was concerned, as not only did he reach his own level of skill, but had even expanded the style a step forward in a new direction. An interesting thing that had happened was that Steve had lost a considerable amount of weight thanks to Nick regularly slipping him some of the workout potion. The little thief was by no means muscular or anything, but had returned to the regular weight and health of his species, which was a relief for Nick. 370. Chapter 370. It wasn't all that hard to get Steve healthy again, as the stubborn critter was easy to trick into exercising. All Nick had to do was transfigure an uncatchable ball from the twins into gold, and then release it in front of the Niffler. It was shocking just how motivated a Niffler can be when the prospect of loot existed. The twins had already perfected the ball, so the only way to get it after it was released was the deactivation spell. Steve looked half dead by the time Nick retrieved the ball from chasing it all over the workshop. Nick spent all of February working on improving his ability to enchant organic materials, and he had made a very small amount of progress. Like before, he was still dealing with a heavy amount of rejection from the materials that he needed to iron out. On a different note, his progress with the sixth-year books was going well, as he had already memorized the books, and was now on the step of practicing the material to integrate it smoothly. While that was going on, he made sure to exert his mana to exhaustion every day, so it grew faster. He only had until he was 17 before his mana stopped growing at the rate it was currently, and he wanted to get the most of this benefit while he could. At the moment, he was at roughly the level of someone who rarely practiced magic after graduation for a couple years. By his estimation, he should reach Tier 2 in mana levels after he undergoes the ritual in 2 more months. In addition to that, his birthday was coming up, and unlike last year, his friends weren't going to allow him to ignore it this year. Thankfully, Ran's birthday was merely a day apart from Nick's, so they couldn't go all out like they wanted to, since that would be unfair for one of them. Other than that, though, it was all business as usual for Nick, though he was planning on collecting the star metal his items had accumulated, until now, since it should be way more than he needed for the Atronak forge. Nick was sure that there was no thing as having too much metal to work with, but he needed to increase the size of the realm to store it all. Dumbledore had been helping with this by supplying spatial magic items that were eaten by the realm to grow in size. The planet hadn't really grown, but the empty space around that had been expanded considerable to the point Nick was sure he could fit a small mountain in the ring. His plan for expanding the planet, though, was very simple as he started to make regular trips into the Forbidden Forest. The random hills and dead trees in the forest were eaten by his realm and broken down into base materials like carbon, silica, and calcium that built up his planet chunk by chunk. Besides confusing the hell out of the centaurs and magical creatures who saw the aftermath of this land grabbing the forest itself, wasn't harmed at all. Nazgul had apparently figured out that she could control her size to a degree as well during the past month, which let her return to the size of a large dog. Her true size was still increasing, however, as the souls of the acromantulas she was eating regularly were a dense fuel for her and powered her growth. Her purgatory flames were also getting more powerful as the quality of the fuel had increased from her new diet. Nick had already swapped the previous seed in the furnace for this better quality version. Still, it didn't change the fact that Nazgul's true size was now the length of two large horses minus her tail, and slightly taller as well. A unique benefit of this large size was that she could be ridden now, which was surprisingly comfortable. Her feathers were soft, and thanks to the horns on her head, it was nearly impossible to feel the wind pressure. On an unrelated note, Lucas had finally finished memorizing the books Nick had given him and was ready to start learning the more hands-on stuff. Nick had to take a week to explain the different kinds of metals, as well as their properties, both magical and mundane. He set up a small sample of each of the metals he had on hand so that Lucas had something tangible to help remember all this information. Beyond that, though, Nick spent the entire month uneventfully until his birthday came around on March 2nd, just after Ron's birthday. Ron got gifts from everyone in the form of candy or gag gifts that he took in stride with a happy smile. 371. Chapter 371. Nick woke up as per usual on his birthday and cleaned up before sitting in the common room and working on his arithmancy calculations for the changes of the Animagi ritual. He had made pretty good progress in his opinion, as he was already on his 85th attempt at getting a success from his predictions. The previous 84 attempts had ended in decreasingly catastrophic failures that turned him into something closer to a werewolf than a magical animagus. Still, he was getting closer and closer to succeeding, at which point he can get an outside opinion on his calculations to see if they are correct. The first of his friends down from the dorms was as usual Hermione. "Happy birthday, Nick," she said with a bright smile after seeing him. "I keep telling you guys that it's not a big deal, it's just another day for me." Nick said with a sigh. "Hogwash. It's your birthday, and that is always going to be a big deal. At the rate you are going, it might even be made a wizarding holiday," she said with a joke at the end. "Ah, don't even joke about something like that. I think I'd die of embarrassment every year if that happened." Nick shuddered at the idea. He was a rather private person, so the thought of the entire world celebrating his birthday gave him unpleasant chills. "You will have done it to yourself. Honestly, how many mad miracles do you have just floating around in that head of yours?" Hermione asked enviously. "More than I should, but less than you'd think," Nick said cryptically. Hermione merely rolled her eyes at that answer, since it was the sort of vague answer he usually gave when he didn't want to answer. About an hour later, Ron and Harry came trudging down the stairs to the boys' dorm, and Nick shook his head at how tired Ron looked. To be fair, though, Ron wasn't a morning person, so he couldn't exactly be blamed for it. "Happy birthday, Nick." Harry greeted with a smile what he said. Ron said with a wide yawn, "Since everyone is up, let's head over to the Great Hall and grab some breakfast before you all need to go to class," Nick said while storing away his notebook covered in numbers and symbols. They met up with Luna, Daphne, and Tracy on the way to the Great Hall, and Nick was once again wished a happy birthday. Breakfast was a simple affair with the standard protein-rich foods that the people in England love in the mornings. Nazgul was unfortunately not allowed to partake, as given her true size, she would clear off the entire Gryffindor table and then ask for seconds. Nick still gave her a taste of the foods she wanted, but those were mostly just snacks to keep her happy. He promised to eventually figure out how to make a version of Lember's bread that tasted like bacon for her, but that was a for-later project. Classes started shortly after breakfast, so Nick split with his friends for the next few hours and focused on his calculations during this time. About halfway through this time, Helena floated through the wall. "Decided to skip the door this time, I see," Nick said with a raised eyebrow. "Old habits die hard," Helena said with a shrug before looking over his calculations. "You got this part wrong. It should be a 6, she said while pointing at a 9 in the middle of his work. He cursed to himself when he saw that she was right and proceeded to erase all of the formulas and work after that point, as it had been tainted by that mistake. Mistakes meant a horrible outcome when the changes to the ritual were implemented, so nothing less than perfection would do. Quantifying something was easy as long as it was a static thing, which the magical phenomena was. Thanks to Helena's previous work, Nick also had the quantification of his race, already, so all that was left was the actual modification of the ritual. Despite that it was horribly difficult, even with the knowledge he had at the moment, so failing many times was to be expected. Happy birthday, by the way. Do you have all the ingredients for the ritual picked out so far? Helena asked, seriously. Nick nodded, but didn't share the details of what exactly he was going to use as a sacrifice. Firstly, because it honestly wasn't info she needed to know, and because she might try to convince him to save some of it if he did tell her. 372. Chapter 372. To be fair, Nick knew he was probably being more than a little wasteful with the parts he chose to use, but the ritual did specify that the rarity and power of the creature whose parts were used affected how big of a boost he received from the ritual. He wanted the best possible increase in his mana reserves, which was why he was using a unique, only one in the world part like the heart of a Daedra. The rest of the parts, while certainly extremely rare, likely had others just the same somewhere in the world. Even the tales of Herpo, the fowl, never said that his basilisk was dead or killed, merely that it guarded his treasures and accidentally destroyed his Horcrux. For all Nick knew, that ancient magical serpent might still be alive somewhere as an even more powerful ingredient than the 1,000-year-old one he had killed in the chamber. Speaking of the chamber, Nick couldn't help but remember the disappointment that he got from the quest he completed. The two items he got were a book about trolls that was mostly just conjecture and a pair of steel tongs. The points were stockpiled like the rest, and the material was a block of iron of all things. It was infuriating, to say the least. Nick shook his head to get rid of that topic, as it just made him angry to think about. The ritual should in theory set me firmly in the next tier as far as mana is concerned, so my control will need to be trained afterwards, but it shouldn't be a huge problem. Nick said, and Helena seemed satisfied with his answer. What about Nazgul? As your familiar, it is to be expected that the sudden boost may affect her as well through your bond. Helena said seriously. I'm not 100% sure how it will affect her, but I assume that she will merely grow a bit or grow slightly stronger, but the change should be minor either way. Nick said, not particularly worried about it. Why would he, when whatever effect takes hold in Nazgul would be a positive one? The more powerful she was, the better for him, as she will be at his side when he clashed with Zeus in the future. From what he understands of Kronos' warning, Zeus ought to be a tier 7 or possibly 8 being. Nick theorized this based on the myth of how exactly both Kronos and his father were overthrown. Kronos overthrew his father with the help of several other titans, and Zeus in turn overthrew Kronos with the help of other gods. This meant that in a 1-to-1 size up, Kronos should be a tier or 2 behind the tier 9 being that was his father, while Zeus should in theory be the same. According to myth, Zeus hadn't sought greater power after gaining hegemony, so he should be the same tier as he was at that time. Nick got rid of those thoughts, though, as he focused on redoing his calculations under Helena's watchful eye. Soon enough, though, the time came for his friends to get out from class, and he had to face the horribly corny birthday experience they cooked up. He got candy gifts much like Ron, but unlike Ron, he was forced to endure as his friends, and even Flitwick shared memorable moments they had with him. Harry had made a point to expound in great detail the first trip to Diagon Alley they had. Nick was embarrassed about his behavior during that time, as he looked like a shy, scared moron at the time, since he was trying to avoid attention. Harry was a very perceptive person, much to Nick's horror in this case, as his friend shared all of the embarrassing points of the trip. It was even worse in Daphne and Tracy's cases, however, as they pointed out how dangerously close to flirting he had gotten when he first met both of them. Luna naively pointed out how Nick seemed to favor her over all the others, and he blanched. Nick was sure that the others knew that she probably wasn't aware of what she was insinuating, but had no problem at all ribbing him over it. Needless to say, Nick had a wonderful birthday, all things considered. The house elves of Hogwarts also had standing orders to deliver a slice of birthday cake to each person during their birthdays, so he got that too. Interestingly, the elves personalized the cake for each person individually, so the type of cake differed from person to person. Nick, for example, loved sour or tart foods, and as a result received a lemon cheesecake with black cherry jam on top of it. 373. Chapter 373. After his birthday, Nick waited a few days before heading up into space to retrieve his accumulated harvest. It came as little surprise to him that each of the marbles were now the size of a mansion on average. Unfortunately, most of that size came from the material attached to the star metal rather than the metal itself. After placing each of the massive collections into the realm, Nick fed anything that wasn't valuable to him to the realm to fuel its growth. This was what consisted of the majority of the collected stuff, and in the end left him with roughly enough star metal to create a life-sized horse statue if he wanted to. He also got a decent haul of other rare metals, such as tritium and hyper-dense iron ferrite, that were mixed in with the star metal. The realm easily separated these metals and left only what Nick wanted. He wasted no time at all melting the metals he was using to create the forge in his furnace, and moving the molten metal into the very large molds that he prepared long ago, while the next batch of metal was sent into the furnace. It honestly looked like a never-ending flow of bright liquid metal floating through the air and into the molds until they were full. The now complete molds were sent into his realm immediately, since he didn't want to have to explain what they were for should anyone see them. Over the next month, Nick carefully carved a small portion of the paragraphs of Daedric runes he needed into the massive rings little by little. He otherwise spent most of his time improving his skill with the school spells or forging rings of protection. His improvement with the school spells had slowed down since the 6th and 7th year's materials were the most complicated taught at Hogwarts. The special thing about these classes was that to take them you actually had to have a certain level of grade in that subject. The grade accepted differed from class to class, but the principle was the same. Nick had long since reached the required skill in the subjects, so it wasn't a problem for him to get the materials for self-study from the professors. Most of them were shocked to see how quickly he had mastered the previous year's spells and knowledge after being exempted, but all of them agreed that it was clearly the correct course of action. Hermione tried to bug him into letting her see the high-year textbooks, since you needed one of three things to get access to them normally. The first was permission from a professor for that subject, which Nick had. The second was an age of 17 or older, as you were a final-year student at that point, and basically considered an adult. The final option, however, was to acquire the texts via illegal channels. Such channels did, in fact, include trying to get it from a higher-year student or someone who acquired it legally. There was good reason for these restrictions as well, since they prevented anyone without the proper level of skill from attempting them and having to deal with the consequences should they fail. Nick was absolutely certain that for most of these spells and techniques Hermione was not capable of at the moment, and that if she attempted them she may die, that's if she was lucky. So despite her repeated attempts to get access to the text, she was denied outright. Still, on the last day of the month of March, Nick placed the finishing touches on the Atronach forge ring configuration and quadruple-checked his work for mistakes, but was satisfied to discover none. "Darty," he called after leaving the realm. With a pop, his servant appeared eager and ready to serve. Has Sir called to Darty about the Vampress situation? His servant asked curiously. Not at this particular moment, but if she has made any large moves, let me know immediately. Nick answered seriously. He had been having Darty keep an eye out secretly for the Vaprace's movements, as she was likely very unhappy at the moment. The woman has only been searching for Mr. Lucas so far, Master, but Darty has noticed an increase in aggression amongst those she has sent to find him. His servant supplied, and he nodded in understanding. Keep me apprised of the situation, for now, though I require you to bring me to the manor. Nick commanded, and his house elf eagerly moved to obey. Nick had long since cleared out the torture room of the manor, and decided to use it as the location of the forge, since it was far sturdier than most of the manor due to its intended purpose. 374. Chapter 374. Nick didn't intend on taking prisoners to torture, so the room was repurposed to house the forge, since the things the forge made might be rather volatile at first. Atronachs were magical constructs, and as a result wouldn't try and keep their surroundings intact when they were first born. Nick would need to command the newly created things to restrain themselves before he allowed them out of this room. That was for later, though, as at this moment, Nick started to take the individual rings of the forge out of the realm and setting them in place at the center of the room. At first glance, the now set-up forge looked like several large rings laid within each other by size, covered in dense, jagged-looking runes. But when Nick tapped his wand on the largest ring that was at the outermost part of the setup and dumped his entire mana reserve into it, this changed. All of the rings began to hum and float into the air, while the runes glowed in brilliant blue. Nick noticed that the amount of mana he used was only barely enough to activate the forge, but nowhere near enough to use it. This didn't bother him, as he had already predicted that this would happen using context clues about the world from which the forge originated. Nirn was a world that was positively drenched in mana to the point magical creatures had been recorded manifesting from thin air, such as was the case with the ice wraiths. Obviously, the enchantments and magic of such a place would likely not work with extreme efficiency in mind like this world's magical processes did. Nick had already taken that into mind when he was tweaking the original schematics rune layout for the forge. His version was much more efficient than the original, but even then, it was an absolute mana drain of heavy proportions to use the forge. Thankfully, he had taken this into account and had Darty and Lucas placing Daedric runestones at the edge of the island for the past month. Each rune stone served as a sort of mana collector and focus that will draw in the mana and confine it to the island, raising the mana density massively. The final step of his plan, however, was to place the keystone of this array of runestones in the center of the mana, so that most of the loose mana concentrates there. At the moment, the rune stones weren't active, but he didn't doubt at all that once he started to activate them, it would create a huge commotion. After all the mana-detecting instruments in the world would likely register the massive flow of energy directed at its single location. It would of course stabilize in a short period of time, but Nick still needed to worry about people figuring out where the island was before it did so. He had taken this into account as well, and added a delayed activation function of varying times to each of the runestones. This meant that even though they would all activate the moment the keystone did, it would take a while before each stone began to draw in mana. This delay was just long enough that it would trick all but the most sensitive instruments into not noticing it. For people like Luna that could sense mana in some manner, though they would notice it flowing in a different direction and probably ignore it. So when Nick activated the keystone in the center of the mana, he was relaxed. He had wanted to use his realm for the forge originally, but he had a spark of enlightenment and realized that he was actually more likely to have it discovered there and settled for the island instead. It would take about a month in total for the runestones to all work fully and saturate the island in mana. In theory, this should act as a simulation of what the entire world will experience after Grindelwald is done. Nick expected the island to undergo either evolution or atavism, as the plants and animals on it adapt to the mana or revert back to their more powerful ancestral forms. Nick was almost regretful that he didn't have a dragon on the island to see what the atavist form of the creature was. Still, once he had the mana he needed to use the forge, Nick knew he was going to start creating an army of Atronachs for the future. This led him to his next course of action that was rather irritating to deal with, bloodbinding gems to himself. To ensure that the Atronachs were born, unswearably loyal to him, Nick needed to soak the gems he used as their base component while making them in his blood. 375. Chapter 375. Bloodbinding was not a new concept from another world or anything, as this world also used it in several ways as well. The vaults at Gringotts, for example, are bound to a bloodline via this method the first time a new member of the bloodline wants access to them. That was the truth of the inheritance test at Gringotts. Not only was it to determine one's bloodline, but also to allow the goblins to make a new key to the vaults. That key was bound to the person who underwent the test thanks to this. It was also used to bind certain artifacts to oneself, as well as to cast spells of some kinds. Nick would have loved to be able to use natural gems to create his Atronax, but his wealth was vast, not limitless. He needed hundreds of various types of gems, all the size of his pinky nail, in order to create the Atronac army. While the gems didn't need to be pure for the magic to still work, purity was a factor in the starting power of the Atronax. Magically grown gems were less than ideal, but better than the horrendous price that natural gems would cost. At the moment, Nick only had the few natural gems he had retrieved from the room of requirement that had chips or cracks all along them. Thankfully, the forge couldn't care less about the flaws of the gems beyond purity and would use them just as well as the others. Nick's best gem, there was a diamond the size of an egg that was flawlessly cut and natural to boot. He could use this to create an extremely powerful air Atronac with the forge, and had been soaking in his blood since he got it earlier this year. Air Atronacs were rare types of Atronacs on Nern that, unlike the closely related storm Atronacs, were made of many large tan rocks with swirl patterns that held up their stony bodies. It may even be better to describe wind Atronacs as stone Atronacs instead, but their elemental alignment was purely wind-based, so that was what they were called. The base form of the rock's alignment was similar to a person in that they tended to have a humanoid face-wide torso and two arms. Air Atronacs, however, had no legs and floated in the air to move about. The terrifying thing about them, however, was that not only were they born with a sword in each hand that they could use to great and terrible effect, but they could also grow more arms and swords with age, and power up to a maximum of 6 alongside 3 heads. Even more terrifying is that they can eat other Atronacs to gain their elemental powers and alignment. Nick wanted an air Atronac very badly to complete his Thundering Warrior plan. With this diamond and the Atronac forge up and running, he would soon get that opportunity. Still with him, now needing to wait yet another month for the mana concentration to reach acceptable levels on the island, Nick returned to Hogwarts. April proved fairly calm as the Daily Prophet stopped publishing articles on Grindelwald's activities. The real problem came in the form of the professors cramming as much of the year's knowledge into the students' heads for the upcoming exams. For Nick, this involved him needing to drastically slow his own progress to tutor his friends in what they should know. It came as little surprise that he was best at teaching Transfiguration and Dada, but even his tutoring on the other subjects was pretty good. He was perhaps not the best of teachers in those other subjects, but he certainly had a better grasp on them than almost any other student in the school. The only thing he struggled with was practical herbology, but he had long since given up any hope in that subject. Sure, he could have made an enchantment that forced the plants to ignore him or something of the sort, but it honestly seemed like a pointless thing to do when he could just have someone else take care of it for him, like Neville, who was a prodigy in herbology. Despite this calm period, however, Nick grew more and more anxious as the end of the month approached, as the date of the ritual was coming up. May 1st, or Beltane, if preferred, was bound to be a momentous occasion for Nick, as his mana reserves were going to get a massive boost. He had already set up the ritual circle in the green house of the manor, and merely needed to wait for the apportioned time to undergo the ritual. 376. Chapter 376. On the final day of April, Nick went to the island and shuddered as he felt the dense ambient mana in the island's atmosphere. It was like a heavy dome of pure mana sitting over the island, and just being in it filled him with energy and a false sense of omnipotence. This might cause some problems after Grindelwald sets off his ritual, Nick thought with a frown. He could tell that this false sense of power came from the sort of high that came from going from a low ambient mana environment to a dense mana environment. The island was absolutely still at the moment, as only the sound of the wind rustling plants and ocean crashing against the sides of the island were audible. This was because nearly every animal on the island was in a state of hibernation as their bodies changed from the mana. It would have taken far longer for the concentration of mana to reach this level had it not been for the fact that the island sat over a ley line nexus. This allowed the runestones to have an already powerful source of mana to draw from nearby, lessening the draw from the rest of the world. Nick walked into the manor and marveled at the power he felt flowing through its walls towards the keystone at its center. The keystone itself was surrounded by a glowing cosmos of raw mana that slowly swirled around it like a galaxy. Walking into the greenhouse with Helena, who hadn't been to the island since before he set up the runestones, he checked the time. Tempus. He spoke calmly with a swish of his wand. 8:53. I still have roughly 2 more hours before the ritual begins. I should meditate. Nick thought as he set an alarm for 10:30 to stop him from missing the optimal starting time. He doubted he could have missed the start of the annual phenomena anyways, since the massive upsurge of mana would hit him like a truck, thanks to his senses. Still, Nick would rather avoid that and turn them off before that happened. Helena was far too busy trying to figure out what was going on with this crazy high mana concentration to bother Nick while he meditated in the center of the complex ritual circle. Bia-ra-ra-ra-ra. Soon Nick's wand vibrated as the alarm went off, and Nick brought his mind back to reality and opened his eyes. Already signs of the upsurge were manifesting that's to the nearly visible mana in the air that was growing restless and excited. Nick stood up from the ground and went into the realm for a moment to get changed and leave his wand, rings, and animal product clothes behind while he put on a loose white cotton robe that went down to his ankles. The rules for this ritual were very clear that other than the wizard themselves, and the sacrifices absolutely nothing animal-based, was to be present in the circle. Nick left the realm after 5 minutes and quickly set each of his sacrifices in their designated spaces before leaving his ring with his realm outside the circle. Hiss! Helena sucked in a breath as she observed each of the sacrifices in shock. She very likely realized the rarity and power of these things and was horrified that he was using them like this. Nick noticed her confusion at the Deidre heart, but he wasn't going to explain that at all. Not that he really could to begin with without revealing the system to her. That was certainly not something that he was ever going to expose to anyone for as long as he lived. Helena didn't get any time to question him about where he got the odd heart from, though, before Nick shut off his magical senses as the mana in the air receded as a precursor to the tsunami of mana coming. Nick waited with the ritual circle primed for action at the slightest trigger for 5 dreadful minutes before the ground shook, and a literal geyser of mana blasted up from the nexus below the island. The circle immediately sprang into action, and the first sacrifice turned into dust and vanished, the lethifold gem. That was the last thing about the ritual Nick remembered as he lost consciousness per the ritual's power. While Nick was out cold, great changes took place within the circle as a vast quantity of mana was pushed into his body. This mana didn't just go into his body, though, as the mana within his body already was expelled and dispersed into the atmosphere. This was why this ritual was called the Ritual of Nature. The wizards or witch undergoing it had their body and mana core refined by the world itself. 377. Chapter 377. For most, this would be an agonizing and horrible experience, as their mana and magical circuits were atrophied or impure, and this ritual cleaned them both out, forcefully. Nick, on the other hand, had pure mana, and all of his mana circuits were sturdy and open from the potion he drank shortly after arriving in this world. The increase in quantity of mana was actually from the sheer pressure of so much mana being forced to such small circuits, and mana core thus rapidly forcing them to expand to accommodate it. Soon the mana that the gems summoned for the ritual vanished, at which time the next part was burnt up, the dragon heart. This time the mana was much lower than the lethifold gem, but still a powerful amount that continued the previous mana's work. The mana flowed in and out without stop, as this was the way the ritual was designed. The phenomena of Beltane lasted a total of 3 hours, starting at exactly 11 the last day of April, and ending at 1 o'clock on May 1st. Every 30 minutes the next part was burnt up, and the focused flood of mana was forced into and out of Nick until it was time for the next part's mana. 3 hours with 6 bursts of refinement to increase the wizard's connection to the world and power. Helena watched this process from the side and noted that the final part sacrificed, the Deidre heart, also summoned the largest amount of mana out of all of them, with an amount so great that she literally couldn't see Nick from the silvery mana, so dense it was visible. She might not know what it was, but she was clear that whatever it was had been wasted, in her opinion. She couldn't blame Nick for it, however, as she had been researching Zeus much like he had since that book was read. What they had figured out about the guard was enough to make even wastes like this acceptable if it meant a better chance of surviving and winning for Nick. Still, it clashed with everything she had been taught and learnt about treasures like that, and made her uncomfortable as a result. Exactly 3 hours after the phenomena began, it vanished just as quickly, and the mana levels on the island dropped back to the point they were at before. Nick woke up shortly after that and was left stunned by what he found. His mana reserved hadn't just increased enough to put him in Tier 2 level, but was nearly at the peak of Tier 2, which placed him next to the likes of Sirius and Lupin in terms of raw mana. It should be stated, though, that both men were in a situation that did not allow much growth in mana for the last decade, so were not yet in Tier 3, but at the precipice of obtaining it. Sirius was in Azkaban, while Lupin was living the wretched life of a werewolf, and as such couldn't study or perform magic regularly. Just their natural growth from before the Potter's death till now had them sitting at the top of Tier 2. Nick was now just a small step behind them in terms of mana. I may actually be able to reach near Zeus's level by the time I graduate if my passive growth doesn't slow down, he thought while marveling at the pulse and flow of mana in his body. Holding out his hand, Nick conjured a ball of flame that he held above his finger effortlessly. My bloodline abilities also seem to have gotten a boost, as this would have been a large drain on my mana before, but now I barely even feel it, he thought with a grin. With a wave of his hand, Arda Milmi reappeared on his finger, and he vanished from the greenhouse. Nick got dressed again and re-equipped his protective gear and wand that hummed as it recinced with his mana. Wands grow with their owners in terms of power, so usually the situation where a wand can't handle its owner's power is rare. Nick's mana was now many times denser and more powerful, so his wand needed a while to adjust. Nick didn't mind this, as all it meant was that he needed to take it easy on spell work until it was done. Much like he had assumed, Nazgul was almost entirely unaffected by the ritual and was more upset about not being asleep than anything else. It should be remembered that it was after 1 at night, and they would normally be long asleep by now. Yeah, you're right, I can worry about everything after we wake up tomorrow, Nick said with a smile while ruffling her feathers under her horns where she likely it. 378. Chapter 378. He was unusually calm after the ritual, as though a great burden had been lifted from him, and in some ways that was quite true. His newly acquired power may take some training to get his previous level of control over, but would otherwise accelerate his preparations against Zeus greatly. Take his current and only active mission, for example. Right now, he theorized that with his current amount of mana, he should be able to knock out the main objective of forging 250,000 rings of protection in about 3 months. He was already right around a quarter, done already at right, around 80,000 rings completed. With nearly quadruple the amount of mana, as before the ritual, he could increase the amount of rings he could forge per day by nearly the same amount. Before he was sitting pretty at a little over 500 a day, but that multiplied by 4 was around 2,000 a day. If the math was right, then Nick assumed that around 3 months from now, he will be done with the first part of the mission. Specifically, in about 85 days, according to the math which he estimated to be around October 25th. The reason it would only be done, then, was that school ended on June 1st, so he would be away from his workshop until September at the earliest at that point. Dumbledore had already stretched the Board of Governors' patience thin with the exemption to all classes that Nick had, so there was no chance at all that he could stay at the castle over the summer too. This meant Nick had roughly 30 days to crank out rings at full speed before he has a mandatory 3-month break from it. That's fine, as I will be busy over the break with my new Atronax, Nick thought the next morning as he was eating breakfast. His friends wouldn't have time to bother with him for most of the month, as they had exams to deal with. Each class's exam was spread between the next 4 weeks, forcing all the students to cram when they weren't taking the tests. Nick was going to drop nearly all other activities and studies for the month to work on the rings. On an unrelated note, Harry had indeed struck the final blow against Voldemort, apparently as prophesy dictated. Apparently the man had pulled a fast one on Nick and abandoned his body after getting serious spiritual damage from the arrows and fled to his nearest Horcrux. Apparently, the chaos of Nick's attack had allowed the greatly diminished soul to slip through his net and attack Harry. In a hilarious twist, Harry happened to be practicing with his dagger at the time and swung it into the man's soul form accidentally. True prophecies might be vague, but they were damn near ironclad in how they must be fulfilled. Harry was supposed to deal the final blow with a power that Voldemort knew not, and he did exactly that. In canon, that power was the hidden soul shard in Harry's forehead and the Elder Wand's loyalty issues. Either way, Harry was finally free of that damnable prophesy and had even started to heal the scar on his forehead. Nick had checked secretly and was pleased to find that with the main soul of Voldemort gone, the shard had begun to dissolve into Harry's soul, strengthening it. The problem Nick had, however, was that the words of Kronos weren't true prophecy in that the Titan had only seen the flow of time in a general sense. True prophecy instead locks the future in place as a very specific outcome to take place. For example, if a seer were to say that you would die on a specific month that was coming up, it didn't necessarily mean this year. Instead, you could live a long and healthy life completely forgetting about that prophecy until you go to sleep during that month as an old person and never wake up, fulfilling the prophecy. The only things that Nick knew for certain was the fixed points that simply couldn't be changed regardless of whatever actions he took. The first was that Grindelwald could not be stopped from completing his ritual, while the second was the return of the surviving guards. The rest was vague, and as such gave Nick some room to wiggle about and push the odds in his favor. For example, if he could figure out where Zeus is sealed, and he could set traps for the weakened guard before he was released. The opposite was also true with the likes of Hephaestus, as he could set recovery items near the sealed craft guard so that he could work with him almost immediately. 379. Chapter 379. Nick basically isolated himself in the workshop for the next 28 days as he put his new power to good use. Dumbledore gave Nick a suspicious look at the end of this time when he turned in so many more rings than usual. In the end, the old goat paid Nick for his work and chose to ignore his strange increase in ability. The old man wasn't stupid and easily figured out what had happened for Nick to have such a sharp growth in power. He himself had in fact used rituals when he was younger, so he knew which Nick had likely used. 2 days before the students were kicked out of the school, they were also freed to do whatever they wished, as the exams were over. I swear Snape's exam was the worst of the lot. Pretty sure the greasy bloke was trying to make us fail. Ron complained to Nick. At the moment, Nick and his friends were sitting in the workshop relaxing and just hanging out. The man does seem like that most of the time, but I'm sure he wasn't doing it intentionally, Nick said honestly. Literally, everyone in the school noticed that Snape had mellowed out greatly after Voldemort died. He was by no means nice, but at the very least, he wasn't in a perpetually foul mood anymore. He had also stopped targeting Harry so much, and actually took his job teaching the class properly. The increase in grades also showed, as he was no longer so harsh with his grading. "How's your scar doing anyways, Harry?" Nick asked, changing the topic. "It's getting better every day. Guess that means he really is gone," Harry said with a smile. "Good riddance. That man caused so many problems that even now we haven't fixed," Tracy said hatefully. The Greengrasses and Davis families had suffered a lot under Voldemort as part of the Grey faction of the Wisengamot, and that hatred still lingers even now. Dumbledore hadn't told Harry how exactly Voldemort was forced into that final pathetic end, so none of Nick's friends knew of his involvement in the matter. Nick was more than happy to keep it that way too, as it would cause drama if they learned the truth. Still, for the first time in nearly a decade, those living in fear of the man's return were breathing much easier as the news was leaked about his permanent death. "That reminds me, but what are your plans for the summer, Nick?" Harry asked curiously, and the rest of his friends were also very interested in his answer. Not all that much really, as I was going to be spending most of my time on my island. Why? Nick answered with a question of his own. Sirius wanted to invite you to the upcoming Chudley Cannon's Quidditch game. Harry said honestly. I thought my dislike of the sport was public knowledge. Nick asked, surprised at the invitation. That's what I told him, but he insisted, something about all work and no play. Dunno what he was going on about, to be honest with you, Harry said with a shrug. As much as I appreciate the offer, I will have to decline. I might invite you all over to the island, though. Merlin knows it could use some visitors to liven up the place. Nick said with a grin. Still can't believe you have your own island. Ron said enviously. And I'm surprised that more people don't. Seriously, ancient wizards seem to love the things for some reason, yet very few modern wizards have one. Nick replied in frustration. It honestly made no sense to him that the frankly abundant islands around the country weren't taken by the old pureblood families or even muggle-born wizards researching stuff in secret. Nick was extremely happy to have his own island, after all, as the privacy simply couldn't be beaten unless he went into his realm. It wouldn't even be all that difficult to make the islands disappear using modern runestones and wards to obscure the land. Asked my mom about that, actually, and she said that it was too costly to keep up if you weren't living there. Daphne added to the conversation. I suppose that I could see that with the storms and frequent rain that an island would get. My ancestor solved that problem with her skill as an enchanter, but for most, it would probably be bloody hard to take care of. Nick said in agreement. He had a bad habit of forgetting just how good he had it in this regard, and had not considered this problem till now. Still, I bet the island is an amazing place, right? Hermione asked curiously. I suppose so. It's got its own dangers, though, so don't wander off on your own if you value your safety. Nick said seriously. 380. Chapter 380. It can't be that bad, right? Hermione asked curiously. Nick shrugged. Depends on what you consider dangerous as well as the circumstances of your visit. If you somehow broke into the island despite the wards, then it would be a nightmare, as there are graphorns, griffcats, horned water serpents, colo, and a very powerful manticore guardian. That doesn't even begin to talk about the magical plants and less dangerous creatures. If you are a guest on the island, though, most of these things aren't a problem unless you decide to make them one, he said casually. You do realize that the magical creatures you listed off are almost all XXXX or higher rated dangerous creatures, right? Daphne asked seriously. Yes, what about it? He replied casually. You know it's illegal to import or own creatures like that, right? Daphne pressed sternly. Nick just waved it off, though. I don't own any of those creatures, though. I own the land they live on, which last I checked was not a crime. He pointed out smugly. That's a dangerous line to tiptoe around, so I hope you know what you are doing. Daphne said worriedly before letting the topic drop. You don't got any spider there, do you? Ron asked with a shudder. Last time I checked, I only had the normal sort plus one species of the magical kind, but they are pretty small. Nick said honestly. What sort is it? Hermione asked, interested. South African jewel weaver, Nick answered with a shrug. X-rated dangerous creature with numbing venom, prized for their stone webs that shine like jewels under direct light. I read about them in the library. Hermione explained, and Nick nodded. The species was almost non-magical in nature if it wasn't for the fact that their webs were clearly magical. They were also both very shy of people, and their venom was almost harmless, which allowed them to have a very low danger rating in general. The kind on Nick's Island were not much different from that rating, other than that the change from the heavy mana had made them more potent and larger than normal. Even after that change, though, they were basically just tarantulas with really nice to look at webs. The most dangerous creatures on the island after the change, there was the horned water snakes and the manticore serum. The horned water snakes had evolved, or rather underwent atavism, into a creature that had long since went extinct, a hydra. There was unfortunately only a single member of the group on the island to turn into a hydra, while the rest went on to become evolved versions of the normal horned water snake species. Ironically, the hydra chose to live in the tiny pond on the eastern side of the island, and like one would expect, was fairly territorial. Nick was forced to place a small filtration barrier in the small streams leading to and from that pond, as the hydra's venom was no joking matter and was causing problems for the fish there. Other than that, none of the species on the island really made any jumps in danger like that single horned water snake did. Seram grew an extra set of black leathery bat wings and gained some serious size, reaching the size of an African elephant, but otherwise didn't experience much of a shift. The venom from her scorpion tail, though, got a nice boost in potency, which was nice. Nazgul, however, was the undisputed queen of the island, as not a single creature on it was willing to stand up to her, including the Hydra. And again, I don't think any creature is stupid enough to try and fight something that can rip out your soul as easy as breathing. I thought with a chuckle as I scratched my horribly cuddly danger beast behind her horns. Speaking of, should I send a letter first, or would showing up unannounced work just as well? Nick asked calmly. My folks wouldn't mind if you showed up unannounced so long as there was no nasty surprises this time. Ron said with a shrug. Sirius said you are always welcome, so same. Harry said as well. Our parents aren't going to be happy if you suddenly show up, so send a letter beforehand. Tracy said for both her and Daphne. My parents would probably be fine with a sudden visit, but it may be best if you send a letter ahead of time. Hermione said, and Luna followed with Papa might want to come too. Nick made a point to remember these arrangements for later and let the rest of the day flow smoothly without trying to control it. Soon enough, it was time to bid farewell for now, and Nick had Darty take him directly to the island. 381. Chapter 381. Nick shuddered as the dense mana rolled over him on the island, but quickly adjusted. It was hard to describe the sort of hellish craving that came from going from rich mana to poor mana on a magical being. There weren't any withdrawal symptoms or anything like that, but there was this sense of weakness that was very bothersome to deal with. It actually made Nick wonder how the hell the guards even allowed the world to deplete to this point without stopping it. After all, he assumed that this feeling got so much worse when you were a higher-tiered being, as it was likely tied to your very life. Wizards naturally lived longer the higher tier they were on average, compared to muggles, so in theory, it was quite easy for a tier 7 or 8 being to live for a stupid long time just based on this power. Nick doubted that the guards or titans were actually immortal by birth, but very long-lived was definitely doable. Anyway, he walked into the manor after arriving on the island and went to find Lucas. The reason for this was because as Nick's assistant, the vampire needed to see the sort of things he would be learning in the future. Nick had thought about having Helena as his assistant, but as a ghost, she simply couldn't grow in the way that would allow her to improve in the styles he had. Celebrimber style directly grows the soul, while Twilight style was all about mana control. Helena simply couldn't improve either of these facets past the point she was at when she was alive, which was an immediate disqualifier for an assistant. Lucas may not be all that talented, but he was both unaging and capable of growing alongside the styles. Nick was honestly glad that he got the Twilight style instead of something else, as while Lucas was learning it, it would help him get the level of mana control needed to feel his own spirit. That was the first step of the Celebrimber style, and was nearly impossible to teach without a stupid high amount of self-awareness. Nick learned the style from the system, which allowed him to jump over this barrier immediately, but Lucas has no such aid, and thus needed to learn it the hard way. Once Lucas gained ample mana control, Nick was going to stick him in a sensory deprivation chamber so he could focus on himself without distractions. The vampire in question was currently studying the guide to metals Nick had left him while looking over the metals that Darty bought with its salary. There weren't any super rare materials in the mix, but the house elf clearly found a good supplier, as there was things like tungsten. Ignore that stuff for now and follow me, Nick said, and Lucas looked confused but obeyed. What's up, boss? He asked curiously. It's time for you to get a taste of the sort of work you will be doing in time, Nick said without actually explaining anything. Lucas perked up at this, however, as he was wondering what sort of stuff he would be taught eventually, but understood that he needed to start from the basics first. He had traveled around for a few years, so he had picked up a thing or two, and even regretted not trying harder while in Hogwarts, because much of that fundamental knowledge needed to be relearnt in order to pick up these new skills. It was also why he wasn't complaining about getting stuck with this tedious learning that Nick had him doing. That said, though, Lucas had gotten the house elf to bring him the old papers that covered Nick so that he could get an understanding the sort of person he was working for. He found out quickly that Nick was not exaggerating when he said he was well known for his skill in crafting. This wasn't to say that he doubted Nick all that much to begin with, as after receiving the flask and ring from him, he was a believer. After reading these news articles, however, he couldn't help but think that he lucked out hard to land this job coincidentally like that. Nick didn't care about these thoughts of Lucas's and led the way to the room that held the Atronac forge installation. What in Merlin's sweaty robes is that? Lucas exclaimed after seeing the many ringed device spinning and humming in mid-air for the first time. This wonderful construction of mine is called the Atronac Forge, and its purpose is to create things based on the materials I give it. In this case, it will be creating a new life form. Nick explained with a proud smile. 382. Chapter 382. Isn't that illegal, though? Lucas asked with a confused expression. Horribly so. Then again, if the ministry knew the laundry list of crimes I've committed, they'd bury me under Azkaban, so one more makes no difference. Nick replied with a shrug. Lucas just stared at him in stupefaction after getting that answer while Nick casually took out the blood-bound diamond and tossed it accurately into the center of the Atronac forge alongside a few bars of goblin silver. This snapped Lucas's attention back to normal as the gem left a heavy blood smell the moment it appeared. The ingredients floated in place within the forge, and Nick tapped his wand on the outer ring of the forge and started the process. A vast amount of mana was sucked into the diamond that started to glow brightly, with most of it coming from Nick himself. Lucas watched on in fascination as the diamond slowly started to break down into tiny grains of brightly glowing sand that spread out before the vast quantity of mana started to transform into pale yellowish sandy-looking stones with swirl patterns all over them. At first, the stones didn't seem to have any real shape, but as more and more formed one began to appear. One humanoid face, followed by a second to the left of the first made out of this stone material, then one arm followed by another, until there were 4 arms. Finally, 4 long, pale yellowish stone swords with swirl patterns formed in the hands of the creature. At this point, the metal broke down and flowed over the edges of the swords, as well as the surface of the stones that made up the creature's body, filling in the swirl patterns. The final result was a greater air Atronac with 4 arms and 2 faces that was reinforced integrally with goblin silver. The rings of the Atronac forge slowed down once its job was done, and the Atronac came to life as the gaps between its stones glowed blue gently. The air in the room howled as the power of the creature ran without restraint, and the rocks shifted continuously while still maintaining its shape somehow. Come! Nick commanded, and the Atronac floated forward out of the forge until it was in front of him obediently. Greater air Atronac on my first attempt, not bad at all, Nick said happily after he checked the creature over. What even is this thing? Lucas asked, confused beyond measure. Ah, right. I forgot I haven't taught you that yet. Apologies. Anyways, this wonderful thing is a type of creature that is generally known as an Atronac. In simple terms, Atronacs are elemental magic given shape and life. For this one in particular, it is an air Atronac, which means that its main elemental alignment is to the air element. Don't let those stones fool you. This thing is almost entirely made of air magic that has been crystallized into what you see now, with the exception of the metal that I added to it. Nick explained with a smile. Is it dangerous? Lucas asked nervously while looking at the strange construct. Only if you attack it, or I command it to be. Right now, though, it's pretty much just decoration. Sure, it might move around, but it won't do anything else, really. Nick said honestly. Restrain your power and follow me. He then commanded the Atronac, and the winds in the room vanished for the most part. Will I learn how to do this eventually? Lucas asked eagerly at this display. That's the idea. In time you will serve as my assistant in most crafting matters, but for now you are still learning. Nick answered before walking out of the room with the Atronac, following closely behind him. He dismissed Lucas after that, and the vampire went back to his studying with a renewed vigor. Nick, on the other hand, brought the Atronach outside the manor and set it on a patrol route around it after taking the time to set the construct's aggression to the minimum. He didn't mind if the thing retaliated after being attacked, but he definitely didn't want it turning violent towards anything in sight that breaths. Should such a thing happen, Nick would likely have to suffer serious damage to the island's ecosystem before he could stop the Atronach. Rather than deal with that, he simply set it on a passive patrol loop around the manor. It was certainly intimidating enough that most creatures that might accidentally wander into the area of the manor would probably think twice about messing with it. The best part of Atronachs, in Nick's opinion, though, was that should someone see them, he could simply say it was a golem, and no one could say otherwise. 383. Chapter 383. With proof of concept now established, Nick now set out to create as many Atronachs as he could. The first Atronach type he focused on was the fire Atronachs because he had a theory about them that he wanted to verify. The process to creating them was similar to the way the air Atronach was created. However, Nick didn't add any metal to the forge. What he ended up with was weaker than normal constructs that looked like women without faces made out of fire and burnt metal. In truth, there was no metal on the creatures at all, as it was simply crystallized mana like with the air Atronach. In theory, I can feed a fire seed to these Atronachs in order to change their powers and appearance. Nick thought, as he took a deep breath before breathing out a thick plume of azure flames at the Atronach. To his surprise, this created a strange chiming sound from the construct, and to his magical senses, the Atronach was undergoing a fundamental shift. Even after he stopped releasing his flames on the Atronach, the changes continued, and he watched in interest as the body of the Atronach began to change. The biggest shift was clearly that the coloration of the construct was now azure and dark blue. Even more interesting to Nick was how the construct had grown ever so slightly larger, and had grown twisted horns on its head that its flaming hair flowed around. Appearance-wise, there wasn't any other changes, but in terms of power, there was a night and day difference. Before, the construct was made of normal flames, but now it was comprised of mana-dense dragon flames, and was thus considerably more powerful than it was before. Nick set this new azure flame Atronach on patrol as well before going to meditate to restore his mana reserves. It would seem that I can only make approximately 4 Atronachs a day if I don't want to lower the ambient mana density of the island. He thought as he cleared his mind and focused on his breathing. It wasn't a lot, but considering they were permanently here, after he made them, that number will quickly increase as he spends more and more time creating the things. Still, the next 2 Atronachs he made were also flame Atronachs that he then fed a fire seed from one of the types of flames he had available. The Atronach fed the cold flames imploded during the transformation, which he discovered was because the base level of the construct was too weak to handle the conflicting energies created by the transformation. Still, he theorized that a better starting point for the flame Atronach should fix this problem. It wasn't a total loss, though, as upon its death, the Atronach's body broke down into a glowing red salt pile. Fire salts, I take it. These may come in very handy soon when I start delving into alchemy, he thought as he stored the burning hot salts away in a highly heat-resistant glass jar. The final Atronach was fed a seed of conjunction, flame, and things got weird as a result. Nick watched as the Atronach violently transformed. First the legs, head and arms sank into the torso of the construct. Then the torso ballooned until Nick was looking at a perfectly round orb of glowing grey flame crystals. Even weirder was that the Atronach seemed to warp space slightly just by existing. Nick set this new conjunction Atronach as the centerpiece of the manor's reception area, as it was a marvel to look at, but didn't seem suited for combat at all. Nick had to call it a day there with his creation of Atronachs, as the ambient mana was getting rather thin. The rest of the day he practiced his mana control in order to regain the control he lost from the sudden increase in power. His wand had already adjusted to this new level of power, so it didn't have any issue with his training. Thankfully, Nick's control hadn't been truly lost, so much as dulled by the increase in power. All he needed to get back to where he was previously as a bit of sharpening. Nick had Darty cook up a meal for him while he relaxed in the bathroom. It might be rather wasteful that the bath was almost the size of a swimming pool, but it was pleasant nonetheless. The hot mineral waters of the bath did wonders for getting rid of stubborn dirt and dead skin after a short soak. Thanks to Daphne's hair care routine, my now shoulder-length grey hair was smooth and shiny like silver. I tended to keep it braided behind my ears in a traditional 11 manner that Celebrimber showed me. 384. Chapter 384. After his bath, Nick got dressed in his pajamas before heading for the manor's dining room to eat dinner. It was a simple meal of vegetable beef stew, but in such a large quantity that it could be mistaken as a party-sized portion. Sadly, it was not, as Nick and Steve were the ones eating it entirely. Nazgul's dinner, on the other hand, involved a large portion of Colo souls and all, much like the acromantulas, though there were so many on the island that she barely dented their numbers. Dusk, meanwhile, was eating off of a platter stacked high with barbecued meat, while in his tiny fuzzball form, since he finally underwent rebirth to regrow his tail feather. The one he had lost, because of Peeves, had been in Nick's possession since that day, but he was saving it for a special purpose. To be specific, Nick was planning to create a very powerful wand out of it, but hadn't had the time to devote to veritology until now to really improve his mastery of the subject. At best, his wood and rune carving skills had improved greatly, but the subject was more than just those two facets. It involved a clear understanding of how the wand core and wood would interact, as well as the various quirks of both. The ironic part was that veritology only became a real craft when a wand maker a long time ago realized that sticks with runes on them weren't the most efficient way to create a magical focus. The exact history of how wands came to take the forms they had today was long and mostly vague, or entirely lost to time. What Nick did know, though, was that the craft had been refined by generation after generation of crafters into what it was now. For example, Nick knew for certain that over 1,000 years ago, during the Founder's time, wands were created out of whatever magical components someone brought to a wand maker. The wood used for them was roughly the same as today, but the cores were strange and sometimes didn't even work. Crazy magical things like mandrake leaves, the heart of their most loyal hound, and other morbid or just odd things. From what Nick understood, though, the item was required to be obtained by the wand's owner personally. This led to a mass of hunting magical beasts to get their powerful parts in order to create a more powerful wand. Interestingly enough, though, the act of hunting one's own wand core material actually did create a stronger bond between owner and wand. The problem came in the form of compatibility between the core and the wizard. Ollivander solved this problem by introducing the Supreme Core theory when he was much younger. This let everyone have an equally powerful wand that was perfectly compatible with them, at the cost of the extra power granted by hunting a core themselves. Sadly, there was a very large problem with wands in general that anyone paying attention to history could spot. After they were introduced, it suddenly became much harder to grow very powerful, and the average level of power amongst the magical community dropped sharply. The reason for this was that the wielders of the wands stopped remembering that the wands were tools to help them cast magic, not the source of the magic. A wizard stripped of their wand suddenly found themselves at the mercy of their enemy, and thus little better than a muggle. Slowly, the mastery of magic itself that the ancient wizards had faded until mere wisps of it remained in the ancient tombs scattered around the world. But none of that is my business at the moment, Nick thought after finishing his meal and heading up to his room to sleep. As a vampire, Lucas didn't actually need to sleep, so a single light in the manor remained on for the rest of the night. Nick was alerted by the ward to the island that someone had entered the island without permission slightly before dawn, which woke him up. Was it dumb luck, or did someone actually manage to track me down somehow? He thought as he got dressed and rushed out of the room in a rush. We have an unexpected visitor. Prepare for combat, Nick said seriously before Lucas could even say good morning. Lucas immediately pulled out his own wand from before he became a vampire with a serious expression before following Nick. They quickly made their way out of the manor and Nick commanded the Atronax patrolling the outskirts of the manor to follow them closely. Row! A loud roar came from the northern part of the island that Nick recognized as belonging to Seram, and they hurried over that way. 385. Chapter 385. The island was only a few miles across, so it didn't take long for Nick and Lucas to arrive at the outskirts of the battle between Seram and the intruder. You've got to be kidding me, Nick thought with a dumbfounded look at the scene that greeted them upon arrival. Standing at the cliff's edge was a small old man that looked frail enough for the wind to blow over, that had shoulder-length thin white hair. In the man's hand was a pale white wooden wand that had a blood-red stone the size of a quail egg affixed to its base. The crazy part, however, was that Seram was fighting a dozen stone soldiers that were clearly giving her a run for her money if the injuries on her were any indication. As if that wasn't bad enough, whenever she would tear one of the soldiers apart, the old wizard would merely wave his wand, and the soldier would be repaired. You two help the Manticore fight off the stone soldiers. Lucas with me on the wizard. Nick barked out commands to the Atronax and Lucas before sprinting towards the old man. Nick didn't recognize the magical signature of the wizard on his island, and thus decided to attack first and ask questions later. Seram looked relieved once the Atronax joined her against the stone soldiers, as the constructs were very effective against them, relieving a lot of pressure. Come, child. I haven't felt this good in decades. Let me shake off this rust, the wizard said with a wide smile as Nick raised his wand to attack. Glad, he spoke, and the wizard's smile vanished as he hurriedly raised a shield charm in defense. Crack! Boom! Not a moment too soon either, as the instant Nick finished speaking, a barrel-thick bolt of lightning flew from the tip of the wand towards the wizard. The wizard dodged to the side immediately after the lightning struck the shield, as cracks formed instantly on it. Nick was not playing around right now and wanted to end this fight as soon as possible. The wizard didn't miss a beat, though, and mid-dodge sent a bright red spell at Nick. Stabbing his wand forward, Nick caught the spell with the mana-coated tip of his wand and flicked it to the side. The wizard saw this and had a look of surprise before smiling again and sending volley of 5 more spells at Nick, all wordlessly cast and moving at different speeds. Nick's eyes flicked between each of them before the rest of his body started to react to the new spells. Swish, swish, swish. Nick's right hand moved in a blur as he caught and deflected the spells one after another while taking a deep breath. F-woom. A thick gout of azure fire leaves Nick's mouths and forces the wizard to stop attacking and defend. The shield summoned this time was much sturdier than the first and held out pretty well against the violent flames. Not well enough that the wizard wasn't showing signs of struggle, however, as he fought against the torrent of flames. Nick cut off the flames as he was running out of breath before moving his wand, Reducto, Bombarda Maxima, Hydri Fumicant. The first and second spells forced the wizard to leave the shield or risk getting blown to pieces, while the last was Nick's personally modified toxic smoke spell. This would force the wizard to try and get rid of the horribly corrosive smoke, or risk getting eaten to the bones. Just like Nick planned, the wizard dodged out of the way of the first 2 spells and hurriedly dealt with the third spell. At this point, a mist reformed behind the wizard as Lucas used the difficult-to-spot mist form to sneak up on the wizard. Expelliarmus, he spoke, and the wizard was unable to react in time from the sudden attack in a different direction, thus losing their wand. Nick wasted no time at all, tapping his wand on the ground and transfiguring the ground to swallow the wizard and his wand, while having several sharp spears of metal pressed against his body from all angles. Seram and the Atronax made quick work of the stone soldiers at that point, as the wizard couldn't restore them anymore. Wonderful, simply marvelous, child. To think I would be caught off guard in such a manner. I'm truly embarrassed, the wizard said with a laugh from his hole in the ground. Who are you, and how did you find this place? Nick asked seriously, with his wand pointed at the man threateningly. Oh good, my new cloaking enchantment is working then. Your help was invaluable to make it, you know. I admit that I may have miscalculated on the reaction you would have when planning this little surprise, the man said with an awkward chuckle. 386. Chapter 386. Nick was confused when he heard this, as he didn't remember helping anyone with a cloaking enchantment. No, wait, I did point out some flaws for one such thing not that long ago, he thought, and realized who was currently in a hole being poked by sharp spears. You realize I could have killed you, right, Mr. Flammel? Nick said with a groan as he released the eccentric alchemist. The thought did indeed cross my mind once or twice recently. What gave me away this time? The old man said while picking up his wand. I haven't helped anyone with a cloaking enchantment except you. Nick said honestly. Ah, yes, well, I do suppose that would make it rather obvious. Speaking of this, must be the young vampire that you took not long ago. Nicholas Flammel, pleased to meet you, the alchemist said while greeting Lucas. Nick frowned at that. How would you know about that? Not even Dumbledore should be aware of this matter, he asked, confused. I happen to be friends with several vampires, you see, and one of them spilled this juicy piece of gossip over tea a week ago. You really should remember to have your house elf wear normal clothes if you want it to remain unidentified, Flammel said with a teasing look. Nick groaned, as he had totally forgotten about that, as it was normal to him at this point for his house elf to be wearing the fancy clothes. How did you even find this place anyways? I personally checked to make sure that the wards didn't have any defects after all, Nick said seriously. Well, I sort of cheated, actually. Left a tracking charm on your familiar at the pageant, since I knew she wouldn't be far from you at any given moment. Then I simply apparated to the nearest spot on the map and went looking for out-of-place magics. I must admit that it was a fun little challenge to crack the ward scheme and get in, Flammel said with a smile. This is a guest, I assume, Sarah asked calmly after walking up. Nick nodded. Yeah, he's a bit eccentric and decided to make an unplanned visit. Good work, by the way, he said with honest praise at the end. It's my job, the giant manticore said with a bored shrug. Fascinating. I have never seen a manticore quite like you at all. Is it because of the mana concentration, perhaps? Flammel asked Seram, interested. Nick just shook his head and sighed. You can go back to your business, Seram. I'll take it from here, he said, and the manticore walked off back into the forest casually. Not you too, come here. Nick commanded the Atronax that went to follow after Seram. Flammel walked up to the Atronax with an intrigued look. Golems. No, far too complex for that. What manner of things are you, I wonder? He muttered with confusion. Atronax, a sort of elemental construct that I created, Nick says honestly. Fascinating, but I can't help but notice that they lack any signs of alchemical treatment. How did you create them without it? Flammel asked curiously. We can talk back at the manor, but first I need to check the wards to make sure the island isn't exposed to the rest of the world, Nick said, and Flammel nodded in understanding. It didn't take Nick long to find the part of the ward scheme that Flammel broke in from and repair it back to the way it was supposed to be. Nick led Flammel patiently through the forest of the island to the manor, and honestly didn't mind how the old alchemist would stop every time he saw something interesting. He had long since known that should anyone with real knowledge and power like Flammel come to the island, they would probably be enamored with its uniqueness. Still, eventually, they got to the manor, and Nick set the Atronax back to their patrols, while Lucas was allowed to go back to whatever he was doing. Flammel was in wonder when he saw the conjunction flame Atronac in the reception hall, as he clearly knew what the flames were. Can I offer you some tea? Perhaps a snack? Nick asked as he sat down in the guest area with Flammel. Yes, I would quite fancy a cup of tea. I can do without any snacks, though, Flammel said with a smile. Nick nodded and called Dottie before having them brew a pot of tea for him and Flammel. I must say that I never expected that this place would have such a high amount of mana. Is there any particular reason for that? The alchemist asked curiously. I needed it to create the Atronax. They are made of crystallized elemental mana, after all. That reminds me, but you might get some better use out of this than me for the moment, Nick said while handing over the jar of fire salts. 387. Chapter 387. Oh, and what might this be? The alchemist said while studying the glowing red salt he had just been given. Fire salt. When an Atronac perishes, its body breaks down into shelf-stable crystal dust that contains dense elemental mana. That jar came from a fire Atronac, hence the name, Nick explained honestly. I see. What a curious creation these Atronacs of yours are. You never did explain how you were able to make them without alchemy. Flamel pointed out with a smile. I used an incredibly complex enchantment, actually. I can't show it to you, though, since it's rather special, and I would like to keep it to myself. Nick explained apologetically. Rather disappointing, but I can understand. I couldn't help but notice that Vampire was able to use regular magic. Your work, I take it. The old alchemist said curiously. It is not that hard to do if you understand vampirism's effect on the magic in the body and have a way to change it to a degree. In Lucas's case, I split the mana distribution from his core between his blood and magical network. Nick explained without any problem. Flamel had been around for over 600 years and was naturally a very curious individual, so Nick doubted it could have been that hard to eventually figure out for him. The Atronach Forge, on the other hand, was an entirely different story, as Daedric runes were an integral part of its construction, and so while it was technically possible to recreate without them, it would be no laughing matter for even someone like the great alchemist. Ah, yes, I believe I came to a similar conclusion at one point, but hadn't put it into practice for fear of causing undue harm should my calculations go awry. Flamel said honestly. Well, it wouldn't work on anyone below the first threshold, as the split places heavy strain on the mana core, but otherwise an even distribution of mana only caused 3.5 weeks of weakness in Lucas, who was on a steady diet of dragon's blood. Nick shared freely. Dragon blood. Rather expensive for meals, no? The alchemist asked in surprise. A minor inconvenience at worst. The real problem was shaking the rust off of his spellwork. A few years of stagnation almost voided the 7 he spent in school. Nick said with frustration. That was really a problem for Nick, as he had to add in the full 7 years curriculum to Lucas's studies in order to refresh his foundation. Since he had already learned the material, it didn't take the vampire long to get back in the swing of it, but it was still frustrating to deal with nonetheless. I imagine, so considering the large differences between normal magic and blood magic. That misty ability of his was also your doing, yes? Flamel asked curiously. Yup, I gave him an extra 4 bloodline abilities, turning him into a royal vampire in exchange for his loyalty. Fair deal if you ask me. Nick said with a grin. Oh, now that is certain to anger that vampress. Are you sure that was a wise decision? Flamel asked curiously. It doesn't matter if she is mad about it since he outranks her now. Not to mention, if I chose to release the information that Lucas was working for me to the public, he would immediately have more political power than she does. I solved all but any covert methods of retribution already. Nick said with a grin. What of the Teeps royals? The alchemist asked with a slight facial twitch that Nick was sure had a story behind it. Well, 4 possibilities exist, if they are even half as intelligent as they are portrayed. First is that they will seek to marry Lucas into the Teeps royals so that they remain in absolute control while adding a powerful new force to their members. Second is that they try to have him killed for the same reason as the first, but this is unlikely unless they also wish to anger me. Third is that they will allow Lucas to build up his own forces to relieve some of the pressure on them with a few concessions from him. The final option is, of course, that they entirely ignore him, as he is not the important factor in this affair. I am. Nick said calmly. I see you have given this matter the appropriate thought, so I will not bother about it any longer. The alchemist said before taking a sip of the tea Dottie just brought. How unusual. The last time I tasted a tea like this was when I found an ancient wizard's storage room under stasis thanks to a chronostone. Flamel said with a smile. 388. Chapter 388. Nick was surprised to hear this, as chronostones were horribly rare natural minerals that had the innate ability to mess with time itself. The most common use for the things was to slow down the flow of time in a specific, or to the point of almost complete stagnation. This allowed one to extend the shelf life of pretty much anything by many, many times. For example, if an item that would only last a second normally was placed within such an area, it could last hundreds or even thousands of years. Unfortunately, ancient wizards had mined nearly every one of these stones from the planet long ago for their own uses, making them very rare to find. In modern times, the most well-known use for the mineral was to grind it into sand and place it in a special alchemical device that harnessed the stone's power to allow for time travel. in other words, time turners. Flamel noticed Nick's surprise at the mention of the chronostone and was impressed. I am surprised you know of chronostones. They are considered lost knowledge by most, he said honestly. There is a book on alchemical items in Hogwarts library that mentions them. Nick explained with a shrug before taking out an English translated version he copied from the realm and handing it over. Flamel quickly flipped through the pages and casually pointed out a few flawed or incorrect pieces of information, but verified that the book did indeed contain knowledge on chronostones. I recognize your handwriting, so I assume you copied the book personally, Flamel asked while handing the copy back. Nick nodded. I like to collect knowledge like that and figured it would be a good addition to my personal library, he said honestly. He had no reason to lie to the old alchemist about such things, as the man likely had a very good grasp over reading people and was unlikely to care about his knowledge or abilities. A common habit for wizards to have, though, most simply take the original source instead of making a copy, Flamel said with an understanding look. It might serve better in the school's library. Now that I think about it, why are you here exactly, since I doubt it was just to get put in danger? Nick asked curiously. We didn't get to speak as much as I would have liked when you were at the pageant, and I decided to rectify that. It seems this was a wise decision on my part, as you clearly have all sorts of wonderful knowledge, Flamel explained with a smile. Not to mention this dense level of ambient mana that is quickly rejuvenating me. He added, What do you mean? Nick asked, confused. Even during their previous meeting, Nick saw nothing that would indicate that Flamel was suffering mana deprivation. You have already mentioned tears during this conversation, so I assume you are at least vaguely aware of the different levels of power a magical being could have, yes? Flamel asked, and Nick nodded. Then you are also likely aware of the term mana deprivation, correct? He asked, and again Nick nodded. Due to the rather minuscule amount of ambient mana in the world, no fifth-tier being is capable of surviving under normal circumstances, which is known as mana deprivation. My wife Perenelle and I have long since crossed the fifth tier, but have had to suppress ourselves back to the fourth and even rely on that stone to survive. But we are only just surviving, Flamel explained sadly. Our bodies atrophy and are frail while our magics are limited as a result of centuries of mana deprivation. But this island has such a vast amount of mana that just being here is alleviating those symptoms. He explains, and Nick was left stunned momentarily. He had assumed that Flamel had figured out how to take that step, but never could have guessed that he had taken it centuries prior and had been suffering mana deprivation this whole time. Why didn't you just do what I did and draw in and trap large amounts of mana? Nick asked, confused on this point. There were 3 reasons for that. First was that I would need a Lele Nexus to do that, much like this island here. Stagnant mana tends to cause problems after all. The second reason was that we would then become prisoners within our own home, which was much worse than a little discomfort. The final reason was that we weren't seeking greater power, so it wasn't necessary to survive and live a full life. Flamel explained honestly. I think I understand what you mean, though admittedly, I don't think I would have made the same choice in your place, Nick said before taking a sip of tea. 389. Chapter 389. I am not surprised to hear that. You do see every bit the ambitious young man after all, Flamel said with a chuckle. That reminds me, what was that flame you used during the duel earlier? He asked after taking a sip of tea, a byproduct of undergoing a slightly modified ritual of breath. Nick explained calmly. Flamel nodded in understanding. You added to properties of the dragon's lungs to your own, rather risky if you didn't have an affinity for flames already know. He asked rhetorically. Nick held up his left hand, and a match-size flame rose from his palm soundlessly. There was no risk involved in that case. He said with a grin, Pyrokinesis, a powerful and useful gift to have in your craft. Flamel said slightly enviously. It doesn't actually see much use in that regard, honestly. It's bloody hard to control abnormal flames with it, you know, Nick said with a sigh as he dismissed the flame. Perhaps, but you do still have some control nonetheless, which most in your craft would give their limbs for. Personally, I think an eagle's vision might be the best suited gift for craftsmen in general, Flamel said honestly. I can see why. Details are very important in most crafts, so being able to see more of them would likely help considerably. Perhaps I should look for a ritual to enhance your sight. Nick pondered out loud. While I appreciate the offer, there is no need since I can merely design one if I truly wish it. Don't let Albus know about your use of rituals, though as he dislikes most of them after some bad experiences previously. Flammel warned seriously. I will keep that in mind. Nick agreed. How goes the compendium of enchantments, by the way? Flammel asked, changing the subject. They chatted for a few hours after that before the old alchemist left with an invitation to learn under him. Nick would be lying if he said that he wasn't very interested in the offer, but he was aware that he needed to clean off some of the work on his plate before he can devote time studying a new and very complex subject like alchemy. He still needed to master the core curriculum of Hogwarts, create a small army of Atronachs, improve his organic smithing method, expand and strengthen his knowledge on the Twilight style, and complete his modifications of the Animagus ritual. Each of these were long-term projects in their own right, and together left him with little free time to indulge in a new subject. Today alone, he needed to create another 4 Atronachs before working on the magic of the higher years of the curriculum for the rest. Nick was going to put off the other things for a different day, as these two were the most pressing. The Atronachs were as easy as feeding the Forge the gems, and mana, with meditation between each one to restore his mana. The curriculum, on the other hand, required Nick to practice fervently. Meanwhile, a certain group was having a rather bad time as they tried and failed to find Nick. I don't understand how the kid could just drop off the face of the planet after causing so much trouble like this. A man with strikingly similar features to Nick said with frustration. The man was holding an orb that had a female voice speaking from in a series of hisses. What the man heard was very different, however. The elder seems to think the brat is holed up on the Ravenclaw Island under cloaking wards that stop divination from seeing it. We are also having trouble convincing Lady Sturm that the brat is exiled to us, and as such his actions are not our doing. You know how natural-born vampires can be over stuff like this. The female voice said with no small amount of irritation. Yeah, this nephew of mine has proven to be surprisingly elusive and skilled after we exiled him for lacking magical ability. Even without any memories, he has started to expose us to the world as people search for anyone related to him. The man said with a sad look. The elder's orders are clear, Monroe. He gets brought back in the fold or erased before he becomes too powerful. The female voice said in French this time. We are long past that point if the reports on Voldemort are right. The man thinks but verbally agrees. The orb stops glowing, and the man puts it into a leather bag at his side. I wonder just how much we haven't seen from you yet, little bird. He thinks before vanishing in a puff of smoke. 390. Chapter 390. Nick spent the next week focusing entirely on these two things, and made a good amount of progress on both of them. There were now 28 Lesser Atronachs of various kinds on the island, and he had almost finished the 6th-year material. Hogwarts' curriculum had a bit of a snowball effect in that each previous year's materials made the next easier to understand in compounding effects. Jumping from 1st year to 7th directly was much harder than doing the same from the 2nd or 3rd year. It was a simple matter of complexity getting broken down and fed in manageable amounts. The final year's materials, for example, were almost the same as the 6th year's, except they were more complex. Still, Nick knew from experience that learning this stuff helped tremendously when learning other advanced things. For example, learning the charms coursework made it easier to understand foreign spells and thus counter them. With that knowledge, it made sense that Flitwick, who taught the subject, was also a very skilled duelist. Transfiguration, on the other hand, had a use in almost every facet of wizarding life from crafting to paperwork. For example, the paper plane spell that the Ministry used was 1 part transfiguration and 2 parts charms. It was for this reason that many jobs after graduation required certain scores in certain subjects. For example, to become an Aura one must score NEWT level exceeds expectations in at least 5 subjects, with Dada, Transfiguration, Charms and Potions being highly valued in the application process. In an ironic twist, though one must score the same in Muggle studies for nearly any other position in the Ministry. Nick recognized that this was in a terrible attempt to make wizards less racist, but it clearly failed most of the time. How could it work when the material for the class was so outdated or wrong that it tended to make Muggles look worse than what wizards thought of them normally? Still, Nick took a break from work or study for a few days after that to relax and recharge his mental batteries. I might be a workaholic, he thought as he sat on the edge of the island with a fishing rod bored out of his mind. It's not that I'm impatient or anything like that, but that I can't help but feel like I am wasting time better spent doing something else, he thought with a sigh. He didn't get to wallow in this strange feeling for long, though, before Darty showed up with a panicked expression. Master, the vampire lady has done the unthinkable, it said angrily. Oh, what has she done this time that has you so flustered? Nick asked curiously. She's put out a bounty on Master Nick's life, 2,000 galleons, sir. The house elf said angrily. Nick was taken back by this, as this was a drastic jump in handling the situation on the Vaprace's part. Reeling the line in on the rod, Nick hooked the eye of the rod and wound it tight before walking back to the manor. He ignored the squads of Atranax patrolling the perimeter of the manor and headed to the room he knew had Lucas in it. Need something, boss? The vampire asked curiously when Nick entered the room. The one who turned you has placed a bounty of 2,000 galleons on my life, and I thought you should know, Nick said casually. Nick wasn't bothered by the bounty all that much, but it was slightly irritating. She what? Lucas exclaimed in horror once he heard Nick. Does she even know who you are? Lucas asked, in both horror and confusion. Nick couldn't blame him really, as this was the same as trying to assassinate a world leader. The wizarding community in Britain is going to go crazy about this and seek to eliminate the Vampress. It should be noted that nearly every wizard in Britain came from Hogwarts, of which a good third were Ravenclaw. As the last known descendant of Rowena Ravenclaw, attacking him like this was tantamount to slapping all of their faces. Exceeded noble or not, this was a terrible choice to make if you valued your life, which was why Nick wasn't worried. Nick wasn't wrong either, as both the public with ears in the darker side of society and those that lived there were bubbling over at this move. Pureblood clans were placing bounties of their own on the Vampress, and those living in the dark parts of society that still had some attachment to Hogwarts were planning all sorts of nasty fates for her. The vampire community was also collectively distancing themselves from her, like she might explode at any moment. 391. Chapter 391. How do you plan to handle this, boss? Lucas asked after calming himself down. He might not be the woman's biggest fan after the way she ruined his life, but he didn't want her dead or anything. Well, there is a few ways I can deal with this that each might end in a different manner, and when I say I, what I mean is we. Nick said calmly. Do any of those options not lead to someone dying? Lucas asked, and Nick shrugged. Some do, but that number gets bigger or smaller depending on your thoughts on arranged marriages. He said honestly. I'd rather not if I can help it, but if the woman's sweet enough, I think I can work with it. Lucas said honestly. In that case, I have a total of 5 plans that involve no one dying in theory. Nick said casually. What do you mean in theory? Lucas asked, confused. Because despite my many skills and gifts, I'm not in fact a seer, and so can't say for certain that no one would die because of these plans, just that no one should die. Nick explained seriously. Better than nothing, I suppose. So what are the plans? Lucas said curiously. Well, first is that you go and command that woman to behave herself, which will expose your new status as a royal vampire to the world. This is actually less than optimal, since it will lead to a series of cascading after effects. The next plan is that we secretly approach the royal clan, and you marry into it, at which point they will not only be able to solve this peacefully, but will also create a tie between me and them through you. Nick said, before pausing to let Lucas really think about these options. The third plan involves watching the woman get forced by her parents into rescinding the bounty after the pressure gets too high. There is a chance that she will die, though, so do keep that in mind. Fourth is that you marry her and cut out this problem from the roots while also letting the world know you are a royal vampire. This has similar implications as the first option, but there are serious differences based on how the royal clan reacts to the news. The final option is to contact the royal clan and show that we are willing to work with them, and ask that they solve this problem peacefully in exchange for some gifts. Personally, I prefer this plan, as it will deal with many birds using a single stone. Nick laid it all out in a simplified manner, since there was of course a lot of details in each of these. Are there any easier options? Lucas asked, clearly uncomfortable with most of these ones. Well, we could always do nothing about it and see how it plays out. Nick offered with a grin. And how does that turn out in theory? Lucas asked, and Nick rubbed his chin for a minute in thought. Rather high body count should things escalate, and peacefully if reason wins out. He answered honestly. How is that better? Lucas asked in horror. You didn't ask for better, just easier. What can be easier than ignoring the problem until it gets too big or goes away on its own? Nick asked rhetorically. What plan has the best outcome that involves someone dying? Lucas asked, but looked like he regretted it immediately. She tragically trips and falls down a flight of stairs and dies. Nick said with a smirk. You never get away with a murder like that. They have people that would know if magic was used on her. Lucas said seriously. Who said anything about using magic on her? There are thousands of ways to make coincidences line up favorably without touching a single hair on someone with magic. Nick said ominously. I think we should wait it out first, and if things get violent, we go with the final deathless plan. Lucas suggested. Nick shrugged. If that's how you want to handle it, then I see no problems with it, he said before leaving Lucas to his thoughts. Still, thanks to this bounty, Nick now knew exactly who it was that had turned Lucas into a vampire, Liliana Sturm. Nick was actually rather surprised to learn that she was the granddaughter of the Sturm clan's patriarch. Why would a highborn like that be interested in a muggle-born wanderer like Lucas? He wondered before giving up on figuring it out, as women were strange and illogical creatures sometimes. 392. Chapter 392. With that matter settled, Nick chose to spend the next week working on his Twilight style while cranking out 4 Lesser Atranax per day. Until now, Nick had only used the style on the 2 most abundant sources of celestial light, the sun and moon. The style, however, was not limited to these at all, and could be used to collect the light of each and every star in the sky above. There was a slight issue with this, however, in the form of the sun and moon's overwhelming presence in the light. Compared to both of those, the light of each of the stars were mere threads the thickness of a hair, which made them very difficult to spark, much less extract. Nick was sure that there was a way to increase the focus on those threads of light to make it easier to extract them, and had chosen to work on that for this next week. He didn't expect to get any real progress made in only a week, but that was fine by him. Strangely, though, he actually got a new mission from the system at the end of the week that left him surprised. Mission conditions established. Description: by your actions in taking a vampire as an assistant, you have gotten the attention of several mysterious parties. Clean up your mess. Objectives: solve the vampire situation, earn favor with the royal clan. Optional: don't allow Liliana Sturm to die. Optional rewards: 3x material tickets, the Pale Queen book. Optional 5x item tickets. Optional status: incomplete. This is going to be a pain to complete, especially that last optional objective, he thought after reading the full mission. It came as no surprise to him that Dottie soon showed up with news about the situation. Apparently, there had been an attack on Liliana Sturm in the middle of a heavily populated area that needed the Obliviators in Germany to work overtime to contain. She survived and was unharmed, but rather than rescinding the bounty on him, she actually tripled it. Got to give it to her. She is very stubborn about this, if nothing else, he thought as he went to go grab Lucas. The vampire in question was left in a daze after hearing about how the situation had suddenly jumped in severity. Shouldn't she have just gone into hiding after something like this? Lucas asked, confused. She is apparently too stubborn about having you, it seems. It's almost impressive, to be honest. Nick said with a shrug. Looks like we're going to have a conversation with the royal clan, huh? Lucas asked with a sigh. Not quite yet. We need to prepare a gift first, or else we'll look like fools hyping themselves up even if what we say is true. Nick said honestly. Aren't they all like stupid rich? What could we offer that they can't get on their own? Lucas asked with frown. You aren't exactly wrong, but you have forgotten something very important. I and I alone have two crafting methods that can do near miraculous things under the right circumstances. For example, that lovely little ring on your finger. Nick said with a smirk. Lucas's eyes lit up when he heard this, as that was indeed something that no amount of wealth could obtain if Nick didn't want to make an item with those crafting styles. The problem comes in deciding what exactly to give them. Obviously, I can't just give them a copy of your ring, since I would need their blood first, not to mention that besides the ability to cast spells, as per normal wizarding standards, the rest was pointless to give them. Unfortunately, I have no intention of handing over the ability to cast normal spells to the Teeps clan. Feel free to add to this conversation whenever, by the way. Nick said pointedly, and Lucas looked embarrassed. Maybe you can let them access more of their bloodline abilities. Lucas offered, and Nick thought that wasn't actually a bad idea. Even amongst royal vampires, there was a hierarchy based on age and the abilities each of them had. By giving a royal vampire even a single extra bloodline ability would shuffle this hierarchy, while also strengthening the hold the royal clan had on vampire society. I suppose that is possible, but I'd need a few tests on you to figure it out. Nick said with a grin. Lucas just sighs, fine, but don't do anything too weird, all right? He asked in a half-begging manner. Not to worry, this will only hurt a little, Nick said before pulling out his wand and dragging Lucas into the realm. 393. Chapter 393. Lucas was subjected to a series of strange experiments within the realm to figure out exactly how normal bloodline abilities in vampires worked. This meant that Lucas had to be subjected to conditions that caused his original ability of water breathing to activate. Nick accomplished this thanks to the water summoning charm Aquamenti. He summoned a large orb of water and directly tossed Lucas into it. Lucas's bloodline ability worked a bit differently than Nick had assumed, as rather than filtering the oxygen out of the water via magical means, it instead caused a pair of gills to sprout from his neck. So this ability is closer to autonomous selective transfiguration rather than a spell. Interesting, Nick thought as he looked over the results that the realm gave him. He then proceeded to change the fresh water into salt water and marveled as the gills shifted slightly in adjustment. Nick spent the next hour alone, switching the parameters of the water to see how the ability would react. High acidity, low acidity, brackish, volcanic, polar, and a few more different possible variations. The ability adapted to each and every type of water flawlessly. Lucas was less fortunate. He had burns, frostbite, and bloodshot eyes from the hostile conditions of the water before Nick finally banished the summoned fluid. He flopped onto the hard ground of the realm limply, but Nick ignored him since he was merely being dramatic. His health was not in any danger at all, and was even starting to rapidly improve as his vampiric regeneration came into effect. Still, thanks to these tests, Nick now had a fairly solid understanding of how vampire bloodline abilities worked. There was unfortunately a single problem that he discovered that would prove to be a pain to go around. Bloodline abilities in vampires were actually limited by the vampire themselves, as it wasn't that they simply didn't have more than 5 abilities at once, but rather that they can't have more than 5. It was a standard matter of pitcher size, which was to say you can only add so much water to a pitcher before it overflowed. In this case, vampires' bodies were the pitcher, and 5 abilities was the overflow point. This was because of an inbuilt survival mechanism that made it so they couldn't exceed this cut-off point, and were thus stuck at 5 abilities. Nick's solution to this was simply to expand the pitcher so that it could contain more abilities. He did this by actually cutting off the royal's ability to use normal magic in the future entirely. The bloodline magic was stored in the blood in the vampire's body, and with the amount of blood in a normal body, the room for them was of course limited. Nick instead chose to create an enchantment that cannibalized the vampire's magical circuits into extra blood veins, thus increasing the room for abilities. He needed to sneak into Hogwarts in order to make the ring to give to the royal clan, since his workshop had all the high-end tools for this, but he vanished before anyone even knew he was there, so it wasn't a problem. The final product was a beautiful silver ring with a simple woven band that had a dragon head design on the top with an artificial ruby in its jaws. The Teeps clan had a thing about dragons thanks to Vladimir Teeps's title of Son of the Dragon. Nick was halfway tempted to have made it a spike with the ruby at the top as a nod to the Impaler, but they hated that title. Nick couldn't really blame them since the first title was given out of respect, and all while the second was basically done out of fear and spite for the cruel acts that earned the man that title. Nick was hopeful that he could get an audience with the King of Vampires himself to make this deal since the man's word was law amongst vampire kind. Unfortunately, that was easier said than done considering that he had vanished from the public eye after the vampire hunt a century prior that had him targeted by a lot of powerful wizards. Nick knew he was still alive, though as news of him shows up periodically in the vampire community when he solves high-level political arguments amongst the royals. The last time he made an appearance was 5 years ago, in a case of a new mithril mine being discovered by two royals and them fighting over it, but openly and covertly. His solution was simply to split custody of the profits between both parties based on the seasons. A simple solution, but not one that two opposed factions would normally agree to. 394. Chapter 394. Contrary to how it may seem, Nick wasn't just giving out valuable gifts left and right without any protections in place. In any of his crafts that held the potential to harm him in some way, he had placed hidden loyalty enchantments that rendered the rest inert should they be used on him. The deal made with Lucas was no different, as he had placed a trap within it in the form of the within reason that meant that so long as he could rationalize an order regardless of how horrible it was, Lucas could not disobey. In this way, betrayal is impossible, since Nick merely needed to command Lucas to return to his work with a bit of rationalization, and he had no choice but to do so. The best part was that this protective mechanism was an incomplete enchantment blended into the others, so there was no way to definitively point out that it was there at all. With the ring done, Nick now needed to figure out how to get a meeting with a royal clan member. It should be mentioned that there are in fact not a lot of royals alive at the moment, since the Teeps clan was very specific about who they turn. That doesn't even take into account the bloody princess that didn't even stay in any one place at once, but wandered the world in search of a mate. The bloody princess was the only known natural-born royal vampire whose father was none other than Vladimir Teeps himself, and whose mother was an exceeded noble with 4 bloodline abilities. Unfortunately, the princess had the perfect disguise ability thanks to her mother in the form of Metamorphagus. And unlike Nymphadora, Tonks the princess actually used the gift properly rather than merely assuming different features or turning into other people. No, the princess could freely shapeshift into any non-magical creature and was as a result damn near impossible to track. Contrary to how it may seem, she was actually the single royal that Nick didn't want to meet. Despite having only slightly less authority compared to her father, the princess was known to be horribly temperamental and whimsical, which was about as bad for deals like this as was possible. Do you know who the royal is in charge of the British vampire community, or how to get in contact with them? Nick asked Lucas after returning to the island. Yeah, it's a man by the name of Jesseph Teeps. From what I understand, he runs the black market in Nocturne Alley, so he can be found there most of the time. Lucas said honestly, any distinguishing features, or do I need to check every vampire we meet to find him? Nick asked, and Lucas furrowed his brows in deep thought as he tried to remember anything about the vampire in question. He has a tattoo of a dragon on his forehead, but that is his only special feature, I think. Lucas said helplessly. Good enough, I suppose. Let's just hope that he isn't one of those people that use a mask while in the black market, Nick said with a sigh. He didn't waste any time transfiguring himself into an adult, but different than before. This time, he turned into a handsome male form with short brown hair and dark eyes. Just for the hell of it, Nick had taken on the form of Voldemort's younger human self, thanks to his knowledge of what that looked like. Lucas, on the other hand, merely put on a mask to cover his face and disguise himself. They had Darty apparate them away from the island before Lucas apparated them to Nocturne Alley. It was clear that the skill was rusty because Nick felt much worse than normal after they landed, but he sucked it down and endured it. They got a few strange looks after they arrived, but ignored them as they made their way to the black market. Nick didn't drop his guard at all, though, as most of those nearby had tainted souls and ill intent. Soon enough, they reached the small shack that served as the entrance to the black market. Nick opened the way forward and walked into the bustling bazaar confidently, while Lucas was clearly nervous. Humans were very visual creatures that tended to base their opinions based upon what they can see. From Nick, one would see confidence bordering on arrogance and paranoia from how his hand rested on his wand at all times. This would tell those looking for easy prey that he was a bad choice, and that would extend to Lucas as well, since he was clearly Nick's follower. They walked forward slowly, as if carefully browsing the various items being sold, but in fact they were scanning each and every forehead they could see. 395. Chapter 395. It wasn't until they reached the end of the bazaar that Nick spotted a dark-skinned man with a dragon tattoo on his forehead and the usual red eyes of vampires. The man had a calm look on his face as he surveyed the throngs of people in the bazaar. He stiffened, however, when his eyes fell upon Nick, and Nick smiled and started to walk over to him. "It was to my understanding that you were dead," Jesseph said with a frown. "He certainly is, but I needed a disguise, and the irony was simply far too great to ignore," Nick said in a friendly manner. "I see and I can smell that your companion is one of my kind as well. Wait, what is this? Who are you to dare imitate a royal?" Jesseph grew angry once he really paid attention to Lucas. Nick could tell that he was about to attack and channeled his spiritual energy into his eyes, causing the vampire to freeze from the pressure on his soul. "It is no imitation, but perhaps it would be best if we go to a more private location to speak on it more," Nick offered with the same friendly smile. "So be it, but let it be known that we will never stop hunting you if your answer displeases," Jesseph said sternly before leading the way into the building at the end of the bazaar. Contrary to its shabby outer appearance, the inside of the building looked like a grand Arabian palace with tall, thick support pillars and a golden and jewel-encrusted throne at the end of it. Nick ignored the scantily clad women that littered the place on beds of pillows looking at him hungrily, mostly because they were all vampires and he wasn't making him prey to them. Jesseph sat upon his throne and stared at them sternly before speaking. "I have brought you into my home. The least you can do is discard these disguises, so we may speak properly." He spoke calmly, but with a clear authority. Lucas looked at Nick, who nodded at him before removing his mask and hood. Jesseph had a small change in expression at that, but remained calm before turning his gaze to Nick, who took out his wand and dispelled the transfiguration on him, causing his figure to shrink and shift back to his true appearance. Jesseph sighed. "Once Nick returned to normal, I thought as much when I saw who he was. Nicholas Ravenclaw," he said, pointing at Lucas. "I take it you can hazard a guess as to why we are here, then?" Nick asked with a grin. "Either a fool or someone confident in their power willingly follows a vampire into their lair. Which are you, I wonder?" Jesseph asked rhetorically with a smirk of his own. Nick tossed the ring he made to Jesseph, "A gift before we talk business. One I am sure is more than adequate to interest the royal clan," he said, without losing his grin. Jesseph turned the ring around with his fingers after catching it and seemed to appreciate the design. He then places it on one of his fingers and immediately shuddered as the enchantment took hold and his magical circuits were cannibalized. "Is this what I think it is?" Jesseph lost all playfulness and went deathly serious when he asked this question. "It breaks the limit that you royals have on your bloodline abilities, if only by a little interested yet," Nick asked with a Cheshire grin. "Ha ha ha. Yes. Let no one dare say that your age hinders you in my presence. What a fine trap you have set for us with a bait we cannot help but want." Jesseph roared with laughter and amusement. "My proposal is simple, really. I will sell equipment made to order to your clan directly, and in exchange, you will assist me in acquiring materials and other resources at reasonable prices. Of course, I will ask for the situation with the Sturm clan be solved peacefully first." Nick spoke casually but firmly. Jesseph was still smiling in an amused manner, but fell into thought at Nick's words. I can solve the stern matter as a gesture of good faith from the royal clan to you, but the rest only the king can decide. He eventually stated honestly. Nick nodded. I would have preferred to go to him directly, but he isn't exactly an easy person to track down, as I am sure you can understand. He said with a shrug. Yes, even now there are those who hunt us for our nature amongst the wizarding community. The king is a prime target for such individuals, and thus secludes himself unless necessary to appear, Jesseph said calmly. 396. Chapter 396. If it is no trouble, perhaps you could stay for a couple days while we wait for His Highness to arrive, Jesseph offered in a friendly manner. That's fine, though I do hope to be subjected to these hungry gazes a little less if possible. Makes me slightly nervous, you understand, Nick said, and Jesseph grinned, showing off his long canines. You heard him, ladies. Control yourselves while they are here. He spoke authoritatively, and Nick immediately felt the amount of gazes on him drop, but not vanish. There was one gaze still on him in the room, but it didn't belong to a person, but rather a bat hanging from the rafters. Nick's magical senses zeroed in on this creature, and he felt a headache develop at what he found. That bat had a dense magical signature that clearly didn't match the body it was in letting him figure out quickly what, or rather who it was. Mina Teeps, or the Bloody Princess, was apparently spying on Jesseph and had definitely heard the entire conversation. Nick made no motions to show that he had discovered her, though, as he wanted nothing to do with her and refused to initiate contact. Jesseph stood up. If you would please follow me, I can show you to the guest accommodations, he said before walking to the right side of the throne that held a stone door that looked almost like decoration if it didn't have gaps. The door had a stylized image of a scarab beetle holding up a flaming orb. Nick recognized this as an Egyptian symbol that represented the god of the sun, Ra. I wonder if all mythology was based on the same gods, just at different periods. He wondered, while trying to figure out whether or not that would even work. Surprisingly enough, the more he thought of the various myths he could recall, he discovered that the gods do indeed seem to share an uncomfortably high amount of similarities. The titles are all mixed up, but the general personalities match up fairly well. He thought, and decided he should look into some other myths about the end of the gods' reign to see if he could find the seals of Zeus and Hephaestus. Nick chose to ignore Hestia, though since from what he understood of her, she won't be taking part in the conflict to come, and thus deserved neither his help or harm. Perhaps it was a bit cruel to treat her like that, but Nick didn't have time or resources to waste on neutral parties just to play nice. Anyways, Nick assumed that the reason the door was marked in this manner was because these rooms were meant for those that walked in the sun freely. He was proven correct when Jesseph stopped outside of a room that had a skylight that allowed sunlight to enter. The room was just as luxurious as the rest of the building, with 4 large silk-sheeted beds and various expensive-looking decorations. The room had a clear sun theme, though as most everything was a warm golden yellow or orange. This is the sun room of the building that I created specifically for wizards like yourself. I beg your pardon, but what is his status in regards to you? Jesseph asked awkwardly after introducing the room. Subordinate or assistant, whichever you prefer. Nick explained honestly. Right, well, your subordinate can take the moon room next to this one since, like myself, he should be less than favorable to sunlight, Jesseph said while pointing at the open room next to the sun room. There is no need for multiple rooms on his account. I solved that problem shortly after he entered my employ, Nick said calmly, and Jesseph was taken back, but looked intrigued after the information fully registered. Very well then, I will have dinner served at 7 at night and brunch at 11 in the morning. Please feel free to make yourselves comfortable in the meantime, Jesseph said with a friendly smile. Nick nodded and walked into the room and scanned it with his magical senses, and wasn't surprised to find several spying enchantments all over the room. Jesseph left after that, and Lucas immediately spoke up. He's a lot nicer than I was expecting. I always assumed that the royals were these old and callous beings that looked down on everyone else, he said while sighing as he sat down on a soft armchair. You don't live long if you can't play nice with others in a social position such as his. Nobody likes a tyrant after all. That said, most of his niceness was fabricated to make us drop our guard, takes a sharp eye to spot, but the signs are all there. Nick said while sitting on another chair casually. 397. Chapter 397. Hey, are we in danger? Lucas asked nervously after hearing what Nick said. Not because of him, or those under him if at all. We have guessed right at the moment, so I doubt he would do anything untoward. Nick said while taking a book out of his realm. It wasn't anything special, just his book on Atronax he bought from the system. Contrary to how it may seem, Nick did regularly use the system, however it was for mundane or other things not worth mentioning. One such thing was expanding his knowledge on a topic if there was no readily available source on it. Atronax fell into this category, considering their foreign nature to this world. The book Nick was reading was titled Myriad Elementals by Arvelos for. The entire book was on the studies conducted by a Telvanni wizard into the nature and varieties of Atronax. It cost Nick 100 points to purchase from the system, but he regained that by making 10 rings of protection, so it was an inconsequential amount to him. At the moment, he had over 800,000 points, just from the rings of protection and other rings he has made. Once he completed the full 250,000 rings of protection, he will have an excess of 2.5 million points. Thanks to this fact, Nick wasn't really sweating over 100 or so every now and then. And oh, did he have plans for that large sum of points in the future, as he was starting to near a very tasty piece of literature in terms of price. Of Realms and Lords by Zillival Zermex was priced at 1 million points in the system and was written by a Dremora that for some reason decided to document the process of becoming a sort of Daedric Lord by binding an empty realm of oblivion to yourself. Oblivion was a nearly infinite expanse of primordial dimensions that were sort of worlds unto themselves that were known as realms. The largest, and thus most complete, were bound to the princes that were basically unkillable guards as a result. An not commonly known fact, however, was that other Daedra were able to bind the smaller realms to themselves and become a weaker version of the princes, depending on the size and quantity of realms they bound. Nick hadn't noticed it immediately, but due to the use of the Daedric heart during the ritual of nature, his own being was now very similar to a Daedra. A very weak and impure one, but a Daedra nonetheless. And as it just so happened, he had a realm bound to him as its creator that would serve as a perfect starting point to becoming pretty much unkillable. In theory, the only way to kill a realm lord was to destroy their realm before killing them, since Daedra with their own realm can't bind themselves to a prince's realm. If Nick can successfully become a true realm lord, he will have much more assurances about confronting Zeus, since he will be nigh impossible to permanently kill. The best part, though, was that Arda Milmi was capable of growth, and thus, if fed enough, will grow so large that it will be able to directly consume the entirety of the earth. At that time, Nick will basically be a Daedric prince with an already populated and diverse world under his command. This was his newest ambition, and also the stopping point on his path to power. Daedric princes were pretty much the pinnacle of power, and thus becoming one would leave Nick completely satisfied. Anyways, the book on Atronax covered the properties of the constructs and how to go about changing them to one's will. For Flame Atronax, it was basically just exposing them to different kinds of fire, which Nick already figured out. For Storm Atronax, it was exposing them to various magnetic substances. Frost Atronax by changing the properties of the water that froze to make up their bodies. Air Atronax were basically changed by having them consume other Atronax, thus gaining their properties without losing their original properties. This was all very interesting for Nick, and he had no trouble at all losing himself in the information, letting time pass by quickly. The food served at 7 was a simple meal of lamb chops with asparagus and potatoes. After that, Nick set up a protective ward around himself, meant to keep him completely isolated before going to sleep. He didn't know it, but this actually saved him a lot of trouble, as a shadow crept across the floor of the room late into the night, completely undetected by Lucas, who was studying nearby. The shadow came into contact with the ward before seeming to reluctantly creep back out of the room. 398. Chapter 398. Nick woke up nice and early the next day as he usually does and stretched before waving his wand to have his bed made again. Anything strange happen while I was asleep? He asked Lucas with a yawn. Not a peep, boss, nice and calm, just like you said it'd be. Lucas said, without looking up from his metallurgy book. Nick hummed in response before finding a seat of his own to continue reading his book. At exactly 11, a scantily clad woman brought in a platter of fruit and sweet porridge for brunch. She remained in the room curiously examining Nick as he ate everything that was brought, but he ignored her. Once the now empty platter was removed again, he went back to reading, since the information was quite detailed and enriching. Around 3 hours later, he closed the book and took out a wooden short sword to practice using it, as Celebrimber had been instructing him from the mindscape. Elven swordsmanship was less about brute force and more about flow and smooth transitions between strikes. This required correct footwork and control over one's body that made it almost resemble dancing in a way. I did not know you two studied the blade. Not to boast, but I was quite the warrior before I became a vampire, Jesseph said, with a genuine smile after walking in on Nick practicing. Nick paused after completing his movement and pulled out another wooden sword from the realm and held it out. Care to shake off that rust? He offered with a grin. Jessep's smile widened in a predatory manner. I think I will, thank you, he said, taking the wooden sword. I admit that I usually wielded a kopish, so the European blade shape feels odd in my hand, he said, giving the blade a few test swings. Nick pulled out his wand and tapped it on the wooden blade, causing it to morph into a strange curved blade with a hook-like tip. Jesseph gave the blade a few more swings and grinned widely. Yes, this is the feeling, how nostalgic, he said happily. Nick tapped his wand against the floor, and the floor and furniture started to shift away from them to give them room to spar freely. Your prowess with transfiguration is quite impressive. I dare say that few adult wizards could match it, Jesseph complimented honestly. Nick just chuckled. Shall we start? He asked while taking a sideways stance with his blade raised at an angle from his right side. Yes, let's, Jesseph said with a grin before dashing forward. Nick was slightly caught off guard, as the entire tone and vibe that Jesseph gave off in this moment was far different than it was normally. He recovered quickly, however, and narrowed his focus on Jesseph while zoning out any outside distractions. The royal coiled his body to the side as he thrust his blade forwards at Nick's chest fluidly. One needed to remember that Jesseph was a vampire, and as such moved faster and with more power than any human swordsman would. Nick could keep up, however, thanks to both his race's innate attributes as well as the effects of the ritual of reflex. Kopish blades had a rather nasty trick to them when meeting a thrust from them with an overhead or side strike, risked having the blade yanked away from you. Nick, as a smith, knew this, and immediately rotated his body to the side while bringing his own blade down at Jesseph as the tip of the kopish glided past him harmlessly. Jesseph's eyes narrowed as he shifted his weight from behind the thrust to try and recover with a sideways slash. Nick merely redirected his own slash to intercept the other blade while carefully hopping up just before contact was made. Crack! The wood clashed, and like Nick expected, Jesseph had used abnormal power behind the strike. Using his position midair and the force of the strike, Nick let Jesseph's blow carry him backwards as he readjusted his stance for immediate retaliation after he landed. The moment his foot touched the ground, all the momentum was twisted through his foot up his thigh abs and shoulders before reaching his arm. Nick's swords whistled as it cut through the air in the vicious, yet smooth transition from clash to attack. Clearly this caught Jesseph off guard, and the strike landed on the upper portion of his right bicep. Both parties immediately disengaged and retreated from the other side in tacit understanding. Should Nick have been wielding a real blade, Jesseph would have lost his arm at best and been killed outright at worst. Jesseph sighed while rubbing the spot he was struck. It seems I truly have grown rusty if I failed to recognize the nature of your blade like this, he said with disappointment. 399. Chapter 399. I'm told going from a warrior to a politician tends to do that, Nick said reassuringly. Jesseph smiled. I thank you for your understanding in this matter. I am embarrassed at my blunder despite my claims," he said apologetically. Nick shook his head. "It is clear from the familiarity you have with the weapon that you were not idly boasting. You did make a very large mistake, though, by relying on your power as a vampire to try and make up for how rusty you were. Take it slow, at least, until you get the hang of it again," Nick recommended helpfully. "I see the Ravenclaw name suits you well as you speak wisely," Jesseph complimented. "Perhaps now come and try again," Nick said as he took his stance again. Jesseph nodded and dashed forward once again, though considerably slower this time. He went for an upward slash this time, and Nick brought his own blade into a horizontal strike, deflecting the offending blade away from himself. Jesseph's hands shifted on the handle, and his blade didn't slow down, but shifted from upwards to downwards in a tight curve, while Nick rotated his hips and met it with another horizontal strike. Crack, crack, crack. The sound of wood striking wood rang out loudly as they danced around each other, looking to land even the smallest of blows. Jesseph made a few more mistakes that gave Nick the opportunity to land hits, but the Royal was rapidly regaining his edge, creating longer and longer periods between each hit. Nick was breathing heavily and had a thick layer of sweat covering him from the intensity of the exercise. Jesseph may have been in better shape, since as a vampire his stamina was nearly inexhaustible, but unlike Nick, he was sporting several new bruises on various parts of his body, with the most notable on the left side of his neck. "While I can appreciate the show of skill, I do believe we still have business to discuss," a heavy male voice says after they separated once again. Both of them look towards the source of the voice, and Jesseph immediately bows deeply. "I apologize for not greeting you upon arrival, Your Highness. I had assumed you would not arrive for another day at the earliest," he said, genuinely respectful of this newcomer. The man was not very tall, but very stocky, with wide shoulders and strong form along the rest. He had a thin reddish face with a long straight nose, wide cheekbones, and piercing red eyes. The man had long black hair and a thick mustache on his upper lip that were both well maintained. The man was by no means ugly, but he had this sort of coldness to him that made him seem unapproachable. "Vlad Drackle the Second, I presume," Nick guessed easily. "Indeed I am, Nicholas Iron Ravenclaw," the King of Vampires said with a small smirk. "I take it then that you were informed of the situation via whatever method Jesseph used to communicate with you then?" Nick asked calmly. "Oh, and what makes you think I didn't receive the message via owl?" Vlad asked, while Nick put away the practice swords that were looking very worn. "Too easy to track. No one who doesn't want to be found would ever leave such an option viable. Well, at least not the smart ones, and I've been told you are something of a genius, so it stands to reason that neither have you," Nick said calmly. "All that from a simply sentence, 'Yes, I think we will get along splendidly,'" Vlad said with an approving look. Nick tapped his wand against his chest, and all the sweat and dirt on him came off in an orb that he then banished, leaving him clean. "Maybe, but we will have to see how this discussion goes first," Nick said seriously. "Bah, it is best to keep business and personal matters separate in my experience, a lesson I learned the hard way, as history will attest," Vlad said dismissively. "The ring, Jesseph, if you would," Vlad added while holding out his hand. Jesseph took the ring off without hesitation and shuddered as he lost access to his newest bloodline ability. To be more specific, it was locked away in the new veins as they were disconnected from the rest. The King of Vampires looked the ring over before smiling in an amused manner. "A double-edged sword, this enchantment, but it does as advertised, so that is fine," Vlad said while handing the ring back to Jesseph. "What do you mean, Your Highness?" Jesseph asked while eyeing the ring suspiciously. "The enchantment allows access to the other extra bloodline abilities by converting one's magical circuits into extra veins, thus increasing the blood in the body. Basically, you lose all hope of regaining normal magic in exchange for the ability," Vlad explained casually. 400, Chapter 400. "It's not like you could use the stuff to begin with, so I imagine it's not a problem at all," Nick said without denying it. "That is indeed mostly true. However, in any future creations, it would be for the best if the way the effects are accomplished is explained as well to prevent any misunderstandings. For now, though, Jesseph, you can put the ring back on as it's safe," Vlad said, and Jessef wasted no time at all slipping the ring back on his finger. "So are we going to just stand around here discussing business, or is there a room for this sort of thing?" Nick asked Jessef calmly. As it turned out, there was in fact a room meant for exactly that was plain, minus a few chairs and a table. Nick and Lucas sat on one side of the table while Vlad, Jessef, and Mina were on the opposite side. It was actually funny how Vlad found his daughter and captured her the moment she peeked her head out of the rafters. Mina Teeps could be considered fairly attractive, as she had long blonde hair and nearly perfect proportions in both her face and body. Her eyes, though, were a shining red, and her skin seemed unnaturally pale, even though it was her actual skin tone, if Vlad was to be believed. The funny part came in with how she was like a child after getting in trouble, as she didn't dare disobey Vlad. Jessef was mortified to learn that she was in his home without him being aware, and apologized quite a lot to Vlad for it. Sitting side by side, Nick was surprised to learn that in terms of raw power, Mina actually dwarfed her father by a wide margin. She wasn't fifth tier or anything like that, but she was teetering on the edge of it, while Vlad was right on the lower end of the fourth tier. Natural-born royal vampires must be crazy talented, that or she's been drinking heavily mana-rich blood for a long time. Nick thought, while waiting for the other side to start the discussion. Before we speak of future business, I believe it prudent to address the matter of your subordinate here being a royal vampire, not of our clan, Vlad said sternly. It was bound to happen eventually that a new royal line was created. However, you have brought forth this inevitability beforehand. Have you anything to say on this? Vlad asked firmly. I honestly don't see the issue with his new status. He won't be turning many people, if any, as he will mostly be working for me. The only real sore point I can find is that your clan is no longer the only royals, but as you have just said, that was an inevitability to begin with, Nick said calmly. Be that as it may, it might create a rift in the vampire community should his status be revealed, which is unacceptable, Vlad stated seriously. Nick just shook his head. Lucas basically no longer is a part of the greater vampire community. He has no place there so long as he works for me, and you know it. A good attempt to squeeze more benefits from me, though, he said with a grin. I had doubted my old friend when he spoke of you, but it seems I shouldn't have. You've passed this test, child, Vlad said, instantly relaxing, as if the whole conversation prior was an act. Ah, so that was why Flammel twitched slightly when he spoke of the royal clan, Nick said, enlightened. It would seem you have spoken with him a bit more recently than I. I take it he showed concern over your subordinate's situation, Vlad asked, and Nick nodded. His caution is well warranted from my understanding, as you tend to get a bit, shall we say, aggressive if someone looks to be edging in on your territory, Nick said honestly. That is true, but this situation is a bit different because, as you have said, your subordinate will not be trying to take power while in your employ. Enough about that. Shall we discuss this business opportunity? Vlad asked, choosing to change the subject. As I told Jessef, my offer is quite simple, really. I sell directly to the royal family my equipment made to order, and in exchange, you help me acquire things that I need without jacking up the price, Nick said seriously. We want a yearly quota of at least one ring for free, as our side requires more effort than yours, Vlad said seriously. Also, you need to become a vampire. Mina spoke up, and Nick frowned at her words.